It was a real shock, because, you know, he was a neighbour.
It was a real inner feeling, we've got to solve this for this young kid here.
Obviously an evil man. I would find it hard to forgive him.
In our minds, there was more to tell. This couldn't be the first time that he'd done this.
On Sunday, November the 26th, 2000, a worried mother called the police, telling them that her daughter hadn't come home after Christmas shopping. When initial inquiries proved fruitless, West Yorkshire Police launched Operation Conifer, one of the largest missing persons investigations in their history. Despite all their efforts, it was 9 excruciating months before they found out what had happened to her. Bramley in West Yorkshire is a suburb of the city of Leeds. Once a picturesque village with a rich industrial past, it was redeveloped into the Bramley of today, but it has retained its strong sense of community.
People do gather, look after one another, so to speak, and like to see one another and have a chat.
Everybody knows everybody. They are pretty friendly. You know, personally, I don't know any nasty person that lives in Bramley as a community.
At 7 p.m. on Sunday, the 26th of November 2000, West Yorkshire Police received a phone call from a Sharon Hawkshead, reporting her 16-year-old daughter, Leanne Tiernan, missing.
Her mother gave us a description, and that was of a 16-year-old girl, slightly built. She was under 7 stones, with long brown hair, light brown hair.
Police immediately got to work interviewing family and friends to piece together her movements that day.
She waved goodbye to her family and set off on the short bus ride into Leeds with her best friend, Sarah, to buy some Christmas presents. Leanne bought Sarah some jewellery for Christmas, and she put those in her pocket, and they caught the bus back then from the city centre back to their home at Bramley. Leanne got off the bus with Sarah at Sarah's stop, which was 2 or 3 stops before where Leanne would have ordinarily got off. But Leanne, being the kind of girl she was, she wanted to make sure Sarah got home safely. And by waving Sarah off where she did, near to Sarah's home, that meant that as she entered the darkness of Huffley Gill.
By this time, it was 5 p.m. Huffley Gill was a secluded, tree-covered ravine with a path at the bottom. It was no place for a young girl on her own, even one in a hurry to get home.
It would have taken Leanne probably about 20 minutes to walk from that point to get home. It was just over half a mile, between half a mile and 3/4 of a mile.
At 5:30, Sarah rang Leanne's home, but Leanne wasn't there. Mum Sharon was concerned, but when she found out what route her daughter had taken, concern soon turned to alarm.
She realised that she'd walked through Huffley Gill, which is pitch black at that time of day, even though it was only 5 o'clock. Leanne's mum started ringing Leanne's phone frantically. It rang for about 20 times and just rang off. She rang it again. It rang for 4 times and then was seemingly cut off. Panic started to set in from that point on. And after a quick search round the Gill by family and Sarah and friends, the alarm was raised and Leanne was reported missing.
It was now 7 p.m, and Leanne had only been missing a few hours, but police knew time was of the essence. The case was assigned to Chris Gregg, who was a detective superintendent at that time.
From the outset, when Leanne was reported missing, you hope that there's just going to be an innocent explanation, that she'll return, she's gone off to her friends, or there's a secret boyfriend that Mum and Dad don't know about.
Police started searching immediately, and it soon became clear just how massive the task facing them was.
That area is quite a dense urban area, a lot of areas to search. There's an area with lots of housing, commercial premises, there's a river, there's a canal, There are drainage shafts. There are a whole range of search areas that had to be considered.
The next morning, with Leanne now missing for 12 hours, Operation Conifer was launched. The hunt for Leanne was on.
And it was important that we literally, to use the cliche, left no stone unturned. And the search teams went through here, searching the whole area for anything as small as the small items of jewellery that we knew Leanne had bought that day for a friend, looking for the mobile phone, an umbrella, any telltale sign which could help us explain what had happened to Leanne.
It wasn't long before everyone in the community heard the news.
It did make people more cautious. There was lots of different rumours going round, you know, but nobody really knew anything.
It was clear that an early forensic response would be needed, so DSI Greg called in the Forensic Science Service, or FSS.
Well, we became involved in the Leanne Tiernan case almost from the outset, once she had gone missing. For reference purposes, if she was found or if an offender came to light, we needed to know her DNA profile and we needed to get her fingerprints. So we actually took her toothbrush and got a DNA profile from that and matched that in with profiles from her parents. And we were also able to obtain her fingerprints from her diary.
After 5 days, the search was still coming up empty-handed, despite the police's best efforts.
The scale of the search to find Leanne was huge. It was one of the biggest search operations the force had ever undertaken. It involved 200 officers, specialist search advisors. It involved the dog section, the mounted section, the underwater search teams.
Peter Grant and his forensic team did what they could under trying circumstances.
The difficulty we faced was that there was no clear scene for us to focus on. You know, there was the last sighting on the bus, and she was also intending to walk all the way home, and the scene could have been anywhere between those 2 points, which was quite a large area. Because a lot of areas were being searched, a lot of items started coming in, but they weren't ones that ended up being relevant to the case.
Getting nowhere, on the 3rd of December, 1 week after Leanne Tiernan had last been seen, the police turned to the media for help.
We staged the reconstruction and they followed the same route, right to the point where Leanne had been last seen. Now, what struck me when we were doing the reconstruction, which was how black Huffley Gill was, I was just staggered at the vulnerable position she was putting herself in when she entered that gill.
Once aired, the response was immediate.
Following the reconstruction, we were starting to piece together some interesting sightings that people were telling us about and sounds that people had heard, and 2 were of interest to us. One was a lady who said that in the weeks leading up to Leanne's disappearance, she'd seen a man, a rough-looking guy, with a dog, hanging around the entrance to Huffley Gill. And she was a little bit uneasy about this guy because he was trying to engage the children into conversation, the school children.
Straight away, the police got the witness to describe the man she'd seen, to produce an image.
Another lady remembered hearing a scream around the time that we know Leanne would have just about entered the gill. And that, again, it might have been connected, it might not, but these 2 pieces of information were important to us.
On December the 4th, police published the EFIT.
We were looking at people in that area who walked through the gill with dogs, and we questioned and found lots of them. We eliminated them all.
With the search still in full swing, officers found out everything they could about the schoolgirl they were looking for.
Leanne was a typical 16-year-old girl who was a lot to live for. She had this radiant smile. She would do anything for anybody. She looked after her grandma, went to church with her, even though she wasn't particularly keen on going to church every Sunday morning, but she did it for her grandma's sake. She'd been in the Brownies, went into the Girl Guides, and she had a group of friends, very popular girl.
Sister Janet Durbin was the minister at the Methodist chapel where the family worshipped.
Leanne did stand out because she was always bright and shiny, always helpful, and she used to like to carry the flag for the brownies and the guides. And as she grew older, we started a Saturday night fellowship for the teenagers, and she used to be one that asked a lot of questions. We talked about all kinds of things that were going on in the world, and she was always up with a hand up and helping. And then Leanne used to like helping in the kitchen, preparing the pizzas and chips and things. She's just a normal young girl.
After 3 weeks, there were still no useful clues, yet police kept on going.
All the time, you're racking your brains. Where is she? What can have happened to her? We've searched 1,100 houses. We've searched drainage shafts, wells, railway lines, canal. We even lowered the canal, almost pulled the plug out and drained it down because it was easier and quicker to search it that way over 3 miles. And we still hadn't found her.
Over the next few months, police continued searching and questioning people of interest. But it was as if Leanne had disappeared into thin air.
The feeling and the belief that they will still be found safe and well never goes away. And I'm sure that is the case with anybody who's facing that particular situation of a young loved one particularly who's disappeared, that they'll be found ultimately. And personally and professionally, you know that the chances of being found safe and well are slim.
By July, Operation Conifer was in its 8th month, and although the physical searching had all but ended, the police hadn't stopped looking.
The network across the UK was fairly extensive that Leanne was missing, and we were getting calls periodically that a body had been found, and we were checking out. We got Leanne's DNA, so we could quickly eliminate anyone who had been found during that intervening period while she was missing.
On August 20th, 2001, almost 9 months after Leanne's disappearance, DSI Greg received some news that changed the investigation completely. Almost 9 months had gone by without a single clue as to where missing 16-year-old schoolgirl Leanne Tiernan from Brownlee in Yorkshire had gone. The longer Leanne remained missing, the more the police suspected the worst. Then police got a call that was to change everything.
A dog walker was in the woods and saw what he thought was a bundle of rubbish that somebody had dumped. And he went over to the bundle and realised that it wasn't rubbish. There was something which he thought was a dead animal in the bags. And he gingerly opened the duvet cover and saw that there was some plastic sacks tied with twine at the top. And he broke into one of the bags and realised this wasn't a dead animal, it was a dead person.
Over the months, police had found dozens of bodies around the country that hadn't been Leanne.
But this one immediately felt different. It wasn't far from where Leanne had been last seen, only 16 miles. The body had been left in a shallow grave, and this just had all the hallmarks of somebody trying to dispose of a body quickly.
Immediately, the scene was meticulously searched.
So when our forensic team started uncovering this, it was found that the girl's body had been encased in 10 plastic bags and had been encased top and tail. So the first bag had been used to put the girl's body in, tied at the top with twine, and then a bag put the opposite direction, tied with twine. And the final bag had been secured around the girl's neck with an 18-inch leather dog collar with a buckle. That parcel had then been put into the duvet cover, and the duvet cover had been used to carry that parcel into the woods. Capturing evidence from this point onwards was going to be crucial for what seemed as though a major crime had been committed.
The decision was made to then retrieve that package intact and take it back to the pathology where it could be thoroughly examined and forensic samples taken, hopefully.
Having examined the crime scene, a profile of the perpetrator began to emerge.
I think the state of the body, particularly the use of ties and the later wrapping and marks of injury, did suggest that the perpetrator had approached this in a coldly efficient, ruthless kind of way.
The packaged body of the unknown girl was taken to the nearest mortuary at Harrogate. DSI Gregg followed soon after.
Living and breathing a case like this for months, I knew this girl. I knew everything about this girl. And the worst possible outcome was that she was now on this table in front of me. And I knew it was her from the moment I looked at her. And I've never had a feeling like it before or since. And there was just something at that moment in time that was so powerful, an emotion, that it was a real inner feeling, we've got to solve this for this young kid here.
Once the bags were opened, evidence was found that would prove key in identifying the killer.
When we found her, she had got her hands tied behind her back with 3 cable ties. And there were 2 black cable ties and a yellow one. The black one was around one wrist, the yellow one around her other wrist, and they were connected between the 2 with another black cable tie, like a daisy chain, in effect, and her hands tied behind her back. She'd been strangled with 2 ligatures. One was a dark woolen scarf with a red stripe running through it. And the other was a clear-coloured cable tie that was around her neck and pulled very tightly.
The pathologist was joined by one of Peter Grant's team.
It was very important that we had a forensic scientist at the scene, and she'd actually identified a tuft of fibre on the back of the jumper.
Although DSI Gregg felt certain the body was that of Leanne, a formal identification had to occur.
We already had her fingerprints that we'd taken from her diary, and we were actually able to compare those with the fingerprints on the diary and get a formal identification that this was Leanne Tiernan.
After months of hoping and praying for Leanne's safe return, it was time to tell the family.
The news that they'd been dreading and fearing for 9 months was now suddenly upon them. And I've nothing but admiration for the stoicism, the absolute dignity that Mum and Dad showed at that moment in time.
DSI Gregg was more determined than ever to hunt down Leanne's killer. Back at the mortuary, Peter Grant's team called in an expert in insects, known as an entomologist.
Within the forensic world, we use entomologists to assist with time of death. When someone dies and they're left outside, there is a clearly defined pattern of insects being attracted to the body, and they'll lay their eggs on the body. And the state at which those insects are present can give an indication of how long the body has been dead.
The entomologist quickly made a pivotal discovery.
He was identifying insects that wouldn't normally turn up until a few weeks after a body has started decomposing. They tend to turn up, certain insects come first, then others, then others. He was getting some of the later insects. Maybe this body had been frozen, in that when you have a frozen piece of food and you defrost it, it tends to go off quicker. And there's a similar process happening here.
Investigators believe Leanne could only have been buried where she was found for 1 week, meaning she'd been kept somewhere else the rest of the time. The big question was, where?
This was as sinister as it gets. A young girl clearly been kidnapped. Where, we still believed it was in that Hufley Gill area. But had been kidnapped, taken somewhere. Was it in the area she was now disposed of, or was it nearer to Bramley? These were all investigative considerations which we were still to find the answer to. For us as the investigation team, there were some really good forensic opportunities here, and we weren't going to let those opportunities go.
Leanne had been missing for more than 6 months, but the police never gave up trying to find her. And then when her body was discovered after 9 months, the missing persons case turned into the hunt for her depraved killer, who police and the Forensic Science Service team were determined to bring to justice.
With the suggestion that Leanne had been frozen or stored somewhere, it became important to, we wanted to know where that was, and I'd established on previous cases that one way of doing this was to look at nasal washings from bodies, because this gives you an idea of where people took their last breath, in effect.
Immediately, pollen expert Dr. Patricia Wiltshire was contacted.
I was called in to get pollen from her to see if I could envisage the sort of place that she had been. Now, we know she'd been buried in this woodland, but had she been anywhere else? Had she been kept anywhere else before she'd been put in the woodland?
Palynology, or the study of plant pollen and spores, was a tool police used quite often.
You've got pollen and spores in the environment, in a sort of mixture. And if someone goes along and picks them up, they will have certain mixtures of pollen, different amounts of different types of pollen, different types of spores on them. And then I know where these plants live and function, so I can envisage a sort of place they've come from. And if I do that, it helps the police find places.
Dr. Wiltshire went to the mortuary in Harrogate.
I irrigated her nasal passages because sometimes people breathe in pollen very deeply up into the nasal passages, right up into the top of the nose. So I irrigated those out, and I also washed her hair very carefully. And from those washings, I was able to get assemblages of pollen grains and spores that her hair had picked up. Later, I worked on the duvet cover, and what I found on the duvet cover matched up with what I found in the ant's hair. And I had pollen, plant spores, I got fungal spores. I also got the conducting elements in wood, of conifers and of flowering trees, woody plants. And they were charred. There was a lot of microscopic charred material. And I assumed, therefore, that she'd been in contact with something that had been burnt. It seemed like a bonfire because there was hardwood and softwood.
Armed with this information, Dr. Wiltshire began envisioning the sort of place Leanne had been to pick up these materials.
I said to the police that I thought it was a very neglected and downtrodden garden, that it had a bonfire in it. And I was also able to say that there was a privet hedge. There was probably either a plum or a damson tree close by. And also, the ground area was very, very neglected, with brambles and all sorts of plants that are weeds, really.
With Dr. Wiltshire's incredible insight, police just needed to find a suspect with a garden that matched. Unfortunately, not all the forensics was going their way.
Leanne's body, with the decomposition, had completely obliterated the potential for DNA and fingerprints on the items that she was encased in. But there were other opportunities that we considered really, really significant.
One of these was the duvet.
Unfortunately, although we did find some body fluids on this duvet, we weren't able to get any sort of DNA result, which was a major disappointment, I think, down partly to the condition of the body. Then we had to fall back on some other types of evidence from the duvet, and we noticed on there that there are a lot of animal hairs that look like dog hairs, all of a relatively similar colour and appearance, suggesting it all come from one dog.
The lack of DNA was a major concern.
We realised we had to fall back on some more traditional forensic methods and maybe build up a forensic picture that we could then use as an intelligence tool to identify an offender.
Detective Superintendent Gregg and his team went back to basics, hoping that something would point them in the direction of Leanne's killer.
The physical items which she was bound with, the cable ties, who'd manufactured them? Where were they being distributed or sold these? Who had possession of them and for what purpose? There was a yellow one, 2 black ones, and the one that had been used as a ligature, the neutral coloured ones. What's the provenance of these? We don't know until we start drilling down and finding out.
While the police got on with discovering where the cable ties and dog collar came from, Peter Grant and his team continued putting together their forensic picture.
We built up a jigsaw, if you like, of different pieces of forensic evidence. We had the twine, we had fibres, we had dog hair.
The items themselves mean nothing. It's only when you start finding out the backstory to the items that suddenly they become relevant. The fibre that was found on Leanne's back, we found out that that was a carpet fibre. And we got experts in Bradford, which is in the textile heart of the north, to help us with this. And they gave us the type of carpet that had very likely come from.
All of this forensic evidence needed a suspect to be of use. Then the dog hair on the duvet grabbed the team's attention.
From the dog hair point of view, although we could tell it was dog hair, we did notice that some of these hairs had quite decent roots, that if it was a human hair, we'd think, well, we could DNA test that.
The problem was no one had ever DNA tested dog hair in the UK. Then Peter Grant made an interesting discovery.
I found out that at that time there was a university in America that had actually established a method to carry out DNA testing on dog hair, so that was our next port of call, with a view to potentially doing some sort of dog mass screen DNA.
If it came off, it could be the break police needed. And that wasn't all. Information about the cable ties used to bound and strangle Leanne had been unearthed.
We found out where they were all manufactured, and 3 of them seemingly took us nowhere. But one of them, we thought this could be interesting. It was the yellow cable tie, manufactured by a UK company, and millions made. And so you think, seemingly, this is going to take us nowhere. But what was interesting about this, as opposed to the others, was that 90% of these were used by the Royal Mail. Could this be somebody who's got connections with the Royal Mail? Maybe, maybe not.
The twine used to tie up the plastic bags also had a story to tell.
It was a unique twine that had been put together from a forensic perspective, was absolutely terrific. You know, because you knew that if you could find more of that twine, you were going to match it up.
The team's momentum continued.
The leather dog collar around her neck. We looked at this dog collar, manufactured in Nottingham. And it was a dog collar that many millions were sold worldwide. So we knew it was a long shot, and we worked out there were X number of pet shops in Leeds that sold these dog collars. We went to every pet shop. We asked them the question, we got nowhere.
While DSI Gregg's team chased long shots, Peter Grant had gone to America with the dog hair to extract its DNA.
After a couple of days working with them, we were actually able to identify that they had a reasonable method and that this was worth a go, and we carried out the test on 2 of our dog hairs, and we did obtain a decent dog DNA profile.
Now police could organise the UK's first mass dog screening in the hope of identifying Leanne's killer. Unaware of this result, police in West Yorkshire were looking at the 120 dog collar wholesalers in the UK.
113 were checked, and the detective got the answer back each time saying, no, no, no. Pet shop, pet shop, pet shop. We supplied her. Company 114, based in Liverpool, gave an answer that the detective wasn't expecting, which was, yes, we do sell those dog collars, and yes, we do have a customer, a private customer in Leeds who bought one. In fact, bought 6 and paid for it on a credit card.
This was the moment DSI Greg and his team had been praying for.
And have you got the name of that customer? Yes. It's a Mr. J. Taylor at Armley, Leeds. Thank you very much.
With that, 10 months after her disappearance, the investigation into the sickening murder of Leanne Tiernan finally had a suspect. The investigation into what was now the brutal murder of 16-year-old schoolgirl Leanne Tiernan from Bramley in Yorkshire finally had the breakthrough police had been looking for. The dog collar found around Leanne's neck had led police to a John Taylor from Leeds.
We found out he worked for a company called Parcel Force, which is part of the Royal Mail. He was living at home on his own in the adjoining township of Armley, which is adjacent to Bramley. He'd been divorced for 4 years, had some children, but they didn't live with him. He'd never been in trouble with the police. People knew him as John the Pet Man. He seemingly kept himself to himself, but we quickly found out that he had a bit of a nocturnal life as a poacher, liked to go out poaching.
The connection between the dog collar and ready access to Royal Mail cable ties was too much to ignore. On the 16th of October 2001, almost 10 months after Leanne's disappearance, police made their move and arrested John Taylor.
Of course, he denied any connection with Leanne, or having done anything wrong, and was denying that he'd had certain pets or animals because we were interested in pets that he'd had with our animal DNA that we were also trying to link.
News of the arrest soon travelled around the area.
It was a real shock because, you know, he was a neighbour. You know, you said hello to him. He used to sell pet food, and my kids used to go over to his house to buy pet food for the rabbits. And it was just a real shock.
John Taylor was taken for questioning, and the Forensic Science Services team methodically searched his house.
The immediate thing that struck us was that there were no carpets in the house. It's just bare floorboards everywhere. But it did appear that, certainly in some rooms, that he'd only recently taken up the carpets. And we actually identified that some of the tufts of carpet still clinging onto nails in the corners of rooms were actually the same red fibres we'd found adhering to Leanne's jumper.
The evidence police needed kept on coming.
The black cable tie that had been used to bind Leanne's hands, we found some broken ones on the fence in the garden outside, exactly the same manufacture and code. We found 2 more dog collars in the house that was still there, that matched the same dog collar that had led us to John Taylor's door in the first place.
Also during the search, there was some rabbit netting found. John Taylor was quite into trapping animals. And the makeup of the twine used to make this rabbit netting was exactly the same as the twine that had been used to tie the green bags.
So all the critical items that to him were so insignificant, suddenly were now coming back to haunt him.
With all this damning evidence mounting up, the forensic team called in Dr. Wiltshire.
I travelled up to Yorkshire, went into the garden, and it was amazing. The garden was so much like I'd envisaged. I just couldn't believe it. But there were 2 bonfires. There were the remains of 2 bonfires. But the elements that I found in Leanne's hair and on the duvet were on the left-hand side of the garden. Also, to approach that area, you had to go under a sort of archway, and there was a big, it was either a plum or a damson. There were no flowers on it, no fruits, but I knew it was a plum or a damson. And of course, I'd found that pollen. I'd found the plum and damson pollen. I'd found all these plants that were in the hedge and around, and all these weeds on the ground. I'd found the remnants of a bonfire in a hair, and I could say, it's on the left-hand side of the garden, not the right-hand side. And it just all came to life for me at that minute.
Dr. Wilshire's accuracy was astonishing. At the police station, Taylor continued to be interviewed.
Faced with this overwhelming evidence, which we now had against him, he said he admitted he'd killed her, but tried to claim it was an accident.
John Taylor then gave his version of events.
He had gone to Huffley Gill that Sunday afternoon with his dog to take the dog for a walk when he saw a young girl walking down the path. He grabbed the girl, told her not to scream. He had a scarf which he tied around her eyes as a blindfold, took his coat off and put it on the girl and pulled the hood up.
Incredibly, at approximately 5 p.m. on Sunday, the 26th of November, John Taylor then walked a terrified Leanne Tiernan the 22 minutes back to his house through an estate and even over a busy road.
She was now in the clutches of this predator.
Once at his house, he took her upstairs and tied her hands with cable ties.
She kicked out at him, and he grabbed her, and he says she fell on the floor and banged her head, and there was blood all over the place. And that's how she died.
It was a story that contradicted the evidence.
Now, he had a problem explaining how Leanne hadn't died from a head injury. She'd died from strangulation. The cable tie that was used to kill her had been pulled to such an extent, so tight it was only 10 centimetres in diameter. He hadn't killed her by accident. He'd strangled her.
John Taylor was doing his best to avoid a murder charge, but DSI Greg wasn't about to let that happen.
We put an identity parade together, and the lady who'd seen the man with the dog hanging around, talking to children, who she was uneasy about, picked him out.
The identification was a persuasive argument for the police's case that this had been a well-planned crime. But there was one crucial bit of evidence missing.
One of the more grim aspects of the scene was that a dog was buried in the garden. And this was a dog that had essentially been hit over the head with a shovel, it appeared. And unfortunately, the dog was in such, again, advanced state of decay that it wasn't suitable for us to DNA test, so we just decided not to pursue that line in the end.
It was a blow that, despite all the effort, the dog DNA was unusable. Officers carried on questioning Taylor.
He denied freezing Leanne's body, but we know it was frozen through the medical evidence. What his story was that after he'd killed her, he didn't know what to do with her body. So to start with, he took it into the back garden and put Leanne's body under a lot of pallets and tried to hide it that way until he could think what to do with her.
Police knew for certain that Leanne had been frozen. They just didn't know why.
Maybe he considered it wiser to actually keep the body inside his house than to put it in the landscape that was currently undergoing a very thorough search.
Another theory was that John Taylor kept Leanne frozen as a morbid trophy he could continually revisit for his grotesque pleasure. Next, he claimed he took her to Lindley Wood just days after killing her.
We know that Leanne's body had only been in the woods for a maximum of a week, and there was a witness who saw a man a week before the body was found lifting a bundle out of the boot of a car that matched John Taylor's description, that matched the description of his car, taking it into the woods.
John Taylor was charged, and then on the 8th of July 2002, over 18 months after 16-year-old Leanne Tiernan went missing, he stood trial at Leeds Crown Court for her kidnap and murder. Faced with the overwhelming evidence against him, he changed his plea.
Taylor had been trying to minimise his part in Leanne's death, claiming it was an accident, an unfortunate accident. But right at the end, he knew he had to face the prosecution case.
There was a great relief to the family not having to go through a whole trial, and he was convicted.
He was described as a sadistic sexual predator by the judge, told he would never be released from prison. That changed, of course, with the new Sentencing Act. He was sentenced to 30 years. But that's the calibre of this individual. He's a killer, shows no remorse. Not once would he have had any compassion for this young girl in his clutches, only what he wanted to do with her.
The local community welcomed the news.
I think there was a sense of relief after it had all come to a head, that somebody had been prosecuted for this crime. But I don't think an area can ever go back to the same again, because you're always wary of other things that might happen.
I would find it hard to forgive him, although we have to forgive him. Obviously an evil man. He'd planned to get somebody, and Leanne just happened to be there. And a cruel man. All the dead animals that he'd just battered to death. I can't understand him.
After 12 months of frustration and dead ends, Leanne's killer had finally been brought to justice.
The case that was built by the whole team was one that there was no wriggle room for John Taylor whatsoever. And I think that's just testament to the professional and thorough job that everyone on this case did.
You don't often witness where killers of this propensity and cruelty are, here in front of you, being sentenced, and the words poured on them from the bench. But whilst it did bring to an end one part of the investigation into John Taylor, it wasn't the final chapter. Because in our minds, there was more to tell. This couldn't be the first time that he'd done this.
As a result of Leanne's murder inquiry, police reopened at least 10 cold case investigations looking at Taylor, convinced this wasn't a one-off. And less than a year after his conviction, Taylor pleaded guilty to 2 separate rapes. The question is, what else was he guilty of?
Uncover more dark secrets that go on behind closed doors. Killer in My Village is weeknights at 11 on Sky Mix.
I was thinking, who would be capable of such a heinous crime?
I was shielded from the raw details.
It did change the village at the time.
As a fledgling serial killer, and that's what he is, I'm glad that at least he was nipped in the bud.
On the morning of the 30th of October 1966, a discovery was made that was to plunge the village of Beenham into a nightmare that its inhabitants would have to live with for nearly half a century. The village of Beanham in Berkshire is only 51 miles from London. But in 1966, this rural community may as well have been a million miles away.
Back in the 60s, we all knew each other. It was more tight-knit than it is now. It's still a very close village and everyone knows each other and looks out for each other.
In the 1960s, Beanham would have been a quiet village. We never got called up to there for any problems at all.
Early in the morning of Saturday, the 29th of October in 1966, police received a call about a missing 17-year-old au pair called Yolande Waddington.
Yolande had only been working at the farm as an au pair for a matter of days before she went missing and was then reported missing by her employer.
At the same time, a discovery was made on land belonging to the farm where Yolande was a nanny.
Some clothing was found in a barn by one of the farm workers. He thought no more of it because previously other clothes had been found there. It was a location used by courting couples.
Unaware of the clothing, police spread the word about the missing 17-year-old.
The following day, further items of clothing were also found within the barn when farm workers went and moved some bales of hay. At that point, Yolande had been reported missing, so the fact that the clothing was found in the barn, reasonably close to where she was living, raised suspicions, and her employer was called to the scene.
It didn't take long before everyone's worst nightmares were realised.
On 30th of October, a body was found by her employer in a ditch close by to the barn where her clothing was found. She was naked, or almost naked. Her hands had been tied behind her back with twine, or baling twine. She had an item of clothing wrapped around her face and stuffed into her mouth. She had an injury to her rib cage just below her left breast, and she also had baling twine wrapped around her neck. It was that what killed her.
1966 was a time before DNA and databases. All they had was good old-fashioned police work.
It was obvious from the outset that it was a murder, and it was treated as such.
Rodney Watson and Gary Deacon were local PCs at that time.
A telephone call came in to the effect that a body had been found in a ditch in a farm track at Beanham. It was quickly established that we had received a report of a missing girl called Yolande Waddington, and as a result, I, amongst others, went to the scene to secure the scene.
Murders weren't known in those days as such, so everybody was sort of rushing around trying to get things organised, and I had to go to sort of do the search that was going to be taking place at the scene. We were greeted with open fields, rural tracks, the barn down the road, and farm tracks, and basically all rural area. We were searching at the time with sort of what would be garden instruments, the rake, hose, garden forks, shears for cutting the grass.
The atmosphere at the scene was quite sombre. Obviously, it was realised that the body in the ditch was a female and matched the description of Yolande Waddington, and she'd obviously passed away.
You'd read about it in textbooks and everything, and you'd done it at a training school, but to be actually involved in a murder search was an experience.
I actually conveyed Yolande Waddington to the Royal Berkshire Hospital, to the mortuary. I mean, I was thinking, you know, who would be capable of such a heinous crime?
Identified by her employer, police were dispatched to give Yolande Waddington's family the horrific news. Giles, Yolande's younger brother, was 8 in 1966.
But I do recall this picture of opening the front door and finding a policeman in his full sort of uniform standing in front of me going, "I need to speak to your mum and dad." And that's the only real record I have. And then I have recollections of lots of people being in the house that were a bit unusual. And I would assume, in that case, there were various detectives.
This had been Yolande's first job away from the family home in Newbury, and despite only being in Beanham a few days, she was known as a friendly, talkative girl. News of the murder travelled through this country village fast.
I can remember the police presence. There were suddenly lots of policemen everywhere. When you came out of school or if you went to the village shop, there were policemen around, and it is quite memorable, something like that. It did change the village at the time then.
Berkshire was really a rural county, and apart from the normal problems that you had, maybe the occasional pub fights at the weekend, murders were unknown as such.
A call was made to London.
In 1966, it was standard practice for the Berkshire Constabulary to request the assistance of a Detective Chief Superintendent and a Detective Sergeant from the Metropolitan Police.
And it was felt that Metropolitan officers had the necessary experience and expertise in order to lead on these rare and serious offences.
With Scotland Yard on the scene, the investigation continued.
In the following days, a thorough search took place of the barn in the immediate area. Various items were seized. Sacks from within the barn, Yolande's clothing, a comb was found, a knife was found, which was believed to have been the knife that caused her injury.
The items were sent to the Metropolitan Police Lab in London for analysis, and then officers concentrated on piecing together Yolande's final movements.
Yolande Waddington was last seen on Friday the 28th of October 1966 in the Six Bells public house, Beanham. She got in there to buy a packet of cigarettes. She appears to have smoked one of the cigarettes within the bar and then left. That was the last time she was seen. It was always felt, I believe, that the offender would have lived in and around the Beanham area because of the isolated nature of where Yolande was found and the fact where she was last seen within the village centre. And therefore, investigators felt that the answer to who was responsible laid within the village. Everyone within the village was interviewed. The inquiry centred on who was within the Six Bells at the time she was, who left shortly after she did, and if they did leave, where did they go?
During their inquiries, officers began unearthing information that could prove crucial to capturing Yolande's killer.
The landlady of the Six Bells was interviewed. She remembers selling a packet of cigarettes to a girl fitting Yolande's description. A man by the name of David Burgess was in the pub at the same time Yolande was there. He'd been there the majority of the evening and left shortly after she did.
Just days after the brutal murder of teenager Yolande Waddington, police already had a suspect. In 1966, the rural village of Beanham in Berkshire was left reeling when the body of 17-year-old au pair Yolande Waddington was found naked and strangled in a farm ditch. Local police had been bolstered by the arrival of the Met Scotland Yard. Items belonging to Yolande found at the scene had immediately been sent for analysis, and after a few days, they already had a suspect, a local man called David Burgess.
He was of interest because he was in the pub, the Six Bells, at the time Yolande was there, and left shortly after she did. The following day, he was seen with scratches on his face. He stated that he'd fallen into a bush on his way home. Police spoke to him. He stated he had been in the Six Bells and then had walked home from the Six Bells.
With nothing else to go on, 19-year-old local lad David Burgess was released, and the investigation moved on.
Everyone within the village was interviewed to establish where they were on the Friday that Yolande went missing.
Over the next few weeks, the usually quiet village of Beanham was a hive of police activity as they hunted Yolandi's murderer.
I can remember the parents being really quite concerned of us kids going out to play, and the people in the village were quite scared.
At the time, our school was just down at the end of the lane there, and we used to just run up the lane and round and home. But once this happened, then all the mums were always at the school to meet us and walk us home. The police presence outside the hall, they were always there every day, which was obviously quite strange for Beanham to have so many police around.
There's always ripples to any murder, but in a very small community, I think that those ripples are felt very, very keenly. Immediately, you start to look at your neighbour and feel suspicious, and immediately there's a fear of people who are close to you and known to you. This is not the kind of thing that happens to us. It's the kind of thing that we read about in newspapers or we watch in plots on TV or in Hollywood films.
After almost 2 weeks of inquiries, where over 1,000 statements were taken, Yolandi's clothing and effects had been analysed. The results were to send the investigation in a direction that would end up making history.
During the investigation at the barn, her jumper was found. On that jumper was blood. When that blood was examined, it was found not to be hers. Following that, it was decided to request blood from every person, every male, over the age of 16 that lived in and around Beanham.
This was a bold move by police, as the science behind it was in its infancy.
Limitations of forensic science testing in the 1960s basically revolved around the limitations of testing for blood. We knew that there were 4 blood groups, and you could break it down a little bit more, but you could never rule somebody conclusively in as a suspect. You could only rule them conclusively out.
Progress, though, had recently been made.
In 1966, 2 forensic serologists working for the Metropolitan Police came up with what they thought would be a new technique that could be used for forensic applications. The new application would help to further distinguish individuals on the basis of their blood.
By early November 1966, police decided to push on with what became the first mass blood screening ever attempted in the UK.
Posters were put around the village inviting men over 16 to give blood, and also showing a knife similar to the one found in the barn. Following the publication of those photos, David Burgess approached an officer within the village and told him that he wants to own a knife very similar to that.
Yolandi's murder would have been very big news in a very small village. So here is a concerned citizen who is giving police information about a knife that they've recently lost. That's very helpful, but it becomes slightly more suspicious when you also factor into account that Burgess was also the last person to see Yolandi alive.
Before a single blood sample had been taken, David Burgess had re-emerged as the police's main suspect.
David Burgess was arrested. In interview, he stuck to his story. The fact that he was in the pub, he couldn't dispute that because other customers had seen him. And the scratches, he explained those by saying he'd fallen into a bush on his way home because he'd had too much to drink.
Despite letting him go again, David Burgess, who worked at the local gravel pits and was already known to the police as a troublemaker, soon became the subject of gossip amongst the local bobbies.
I was kept abreast of things through snippets of colleagues who were undertaking the parts of the inquiry teams, and it became obvious that David Burgess was the chief suspect, although it was proving difficult to back up his claims with actually corroborative evidence.
Frustrated they couldn't prove Burgess's guilt, police continued looking into other local men.
My dad actually got arrested for the murder for Yolandi, because what happened was the bus stop used to be outside the Six Bells pub, and he was in the pub and he had a Land Rover, and he said to her, because he was tipping down around, sit in my Land Rover while you wait for the bus. And somebody must have clocked that, and he got arrested and taken in, but he in the next day was released, so they know he never done it.
There were 16 men that were of particular interest to the investigation. However, one by one, those men were eliminated.
With the investigation floundering, police still had what they hoped would be the ace up their sleeve. On November the 23rd, 1966, blood samples were taken from every male between the ages of 16 and 50 living in Beenham.
In excess of 200 men had their blood taken. The type of blood grouping that was done was new.
This case was certainly one of the first times that mass blood screening was used. The most well-known instance happened in the 1980s, but this predates it by at least 20 years.
Police were hoping that identifying whose blood was on Yolande's jumper would lead them to her killer.
They were able to say that only 2% of the population would have had blood of that type, and that was borne out by the fact that out of in excess of 200 men that gave their blood, only 4 people had the same blood grouping as that found on Yolande's jumper.
Police were desperately hoping David Burgess was one of them.
It wasn't his blood on the jumper, or his blood didn't appear to match the grouping that was found on Yolande's jumper, so there wasn't a great deal more that the police could do. With the 4 men whose blood matched the grouping of the blood found on Yolande's jumper, they were all subject of intense investigation. All of them had alibis for what they were doing, and therefore were ruled out of the investigation.
It had been a massive gamble to take this unprecedented step in the investigation. Unfortunately, it hadn't paid off, and the police were back to square one.
The investigation was obviously limited as to what they could do forensically. They did all they could in relation to try and show who was at the scene with Yolande, but back in 1966, they couldn't progress it.
With no new evidence coming to light, there was a difficult decision to make.
The investigation finished in March 1967. The officers had done all they could to try and establish who was responsible for Yolande's death, but unfortunately, after almost 6 months, they had no evidence that could be used to charge someone with her death.
I imagine that the killer would be feeling that they'd gotten away with it, they'd been successful, and they'd be feeling quite a thrill from that. They'd be feeling empowered and invincible.
The investigation was never officially closed, and suspicions remained about David Burgess. But for now, the evidence from the scene was stored for future analysis. Despite all the police's efforts, the murder of Yolande Waddington remained unsolved. After 6 months, the investigation into the murder of 17-year-old au pair Yolande Waddington had been stopped. The village of Beenham looked as if it was going to be living with a killer on the loose for the foreseeable future. Inquiries may have ended, but despite there not being a match in the UK's first mass blood screening, local troublemaker David Burgess remained the police's prime suspect. This was a village on the edge. On the 17th of April 1967, the village of Beenham hit the news again.
We got another call come in to say that 2 9-year-old girls hadn't returned home after going out to play in the village of Beenham. And we all thought, no, this cannot be. Surely nothing's happened to them. But I attended with a lot of officers, probably 20 to 30, and volunteers from the village. And we searched the area by some gravel pits, and having been issued with the whistles to blow if anything was found, after about half an hour or so, somebody blew a whistle.
The whistle could mean only one thing.
When the call came in to say 2 bodies had been found, then you get a bit disheartened, you think, how sad. And it was a lonely area, these 2 young children, as they were, out there on their own, and something had happened. Devastating, really, yes.
The awful news reverberated around the village.
We were really in shock. and the teachers were in shock, parents were in shock, and it was really quite scary, actually.
Police quickly got to work. They were determined that this murder would not go unsolved.
It was obvious that these two girls had been murdered, so an investigation took place.
It wasn't long before police had a person of interest, and the name didn't come as much of a surprise.
Because David Burgess was one of the main suspects in the Yolandes case, the fact that he worked so close to where the bodies of the two 9-year-olds were found made him a strong suspect almost from the outset. He was interviewed, his clothing was seized, and from one of his boots some blood was found, and that blood grouping matched one of the girls.
David Burgess was charged with the monstrous killing of the two 9-year-old girls, Jeanette Wigmore and Jacqueline Williams.
We'd heard that Burgess had been arrested on the possibility of committing the murders of the two schoolgirls, and I suppose we were all really delighted.
In July of 1967, just 4 months after the horrific killings of Jeanette and Jacqueline, David Burgess was presented at Reading Crown Court accused of their murder. It was a swift, uncomplicated hearing.
Burgess stood trial and was convicted of both the murders of both 9-year-olds in July 1967.
Escorted to his life sentence by Rodney Watson, Burgess's behaviour was, under the circumstances, bizarre.
And I was handcuffed to him in the dock, but most of the time he didn't really seem worried about what was happening. He kept on looking round, occasionally laughing, chuckling to himself, and not really worried about proceedings. And a very strange person I found to be in that position. I would have been worried myself. And then he was remanded in custody and then taken down and then released into the prison authorities. And that was the last time I ever saw him, in fact.
Now, I know that when I assess psychopaths, some of the things that I look for are callousness, lack of empathy, but just a general blunting of emotional response and effect. Now, here is somebody who is acting very oddly indeed. We know that he's not got a mental illness, but you have to question what else is going on.
Rodney's macabre introduction to the darker side of police work was over. But there was still one question that remained unanswered. Who had murdered Yolande Waddington? In 1968, a potential answer came from prison.
David Burgess admitted to being responsible for causing Yolande's death to a prison officer, and that prison officer subsequently made a statement to police.
Could the man who police had always suspected of Yolande's depraved murder be confessing?
On April 3rd, 1968, Burgess was interviewed in prison by police officers in relation to the admissions he'd made concerning Yolande's death. To those officers, he said words to the effect of, "You'll have to prove it."
The fact that somebody was prepared to indulge in this sort of conversation and admissions and them saying you prove it as if it was some sort of game, totally disrespectful to the girl and the family and the family of the two other girls.
In talking about Yolande's murder and taking responsibility for that murder, Burgess is meeting two needs. First of all, he's letting people know how clever he is because he's got away with murder. But also, crucially, he's re-engaging with that murder and re-engaging with the emotions that that murder brought about in him. So he's feeling powerful, he's feeling a thrill. And let's face it, when you're incarcerated, there are very few other outlets for that type of thing. If you can't commit a murder, you talk about a murder.
Police decided to test Burgess's blood one more time.
Following his admissions, the jumper was tested yet again in relation to the blood found, and a report was submitted to the Director of Public Prosecutions. However, the blood grouping still didn't match that of Burgess, and as a result of that, the Director of Public Prosecutions stated that he didn't believe it was worthwhile pursuing the charge against Burgess.
It was a bitter blow, and it was looking like Yolandi's murder was never going to be solved. In 1996, 48-year-old convicted double child murderer David Burgess absconded from open prison.
At one point, Burgess was on the run for in the region of 18 months and took over the identity of someone that he knew that had died. Was subsequently arrested when he committed an armed robbery. We don't know where he was throughout the 18 months.
Sexual offending by its nature is addictive, and here is an individual who would be at very high risk of reoffending. But that's not to say that other murders would be inevitable, although they are possible.
When I heard that he'd escaped from an open prison, my thoughts were, how could somebody who's killed two 9-year-old girls be deemed safe to allow out into the public?
By February 1998, David Burgess was back in prison, whilst Beanham tried to get back to normal. But the village always had a cloud hanging over it.
There's a very good history of Beanham, which was written by the local history group some 10 years ago now, but it doesn't mention the murders.
It was a subject that was almost taboo.
I would say I would very rarely hear anyone talking about it here in the pub.
As many tried to forget, Giles, Yolandi's younger brother, was just finding out the full horror of what had happened to his sister.
I discovered a pile of press cuttings hidden away out of view. Obviously being put away so that I didn't find them, but I did, and there was this sort of Yolandi's photograph plastered on the front page, and there were sort of police and other sort of articles. So I found out a little bit to know that my sister had been murdered.
With David Burgess safely back behind bars, advances were being made in DNA analysis, meaning previously unsolved murders were worth revisiting.
In 1985, research published at the University of Leicester proved that new DNA analysis techniques could be used to link specific individuals to offences, and has since been used in many different capacities to solve homicides and sexual assault cases.
This breakthrough led to cold case units being set up by police forces around the country.
I retired in 2007 and then came back in my current role as a member of police staff, reinvestigating historic cases.
Eventually, in September 2010, the Thames Valley Major Crime Review Team turned their attention to the unsolved murder of Yolandi Waddington.
So with Yolandi's case, we initially looked at what the case was about, looked at what case papers we had, and importantly what exhibits we had, and did an audit of those exhibits to see what was still in existence, and then did an assessment as to what potential there was to use new forensic techniques on those exhibits.
Could advances in forensic sciences finally help police find Yolandi's killer 44 years after her murder? Up until 2010, the 1966 murder of Yolandi Waddington remained unsolved, despite the police believing that double child murderer David Burgess had been responsible from the very beginning. Then Thames Valley Police decided to reopen Yolandi's case to see if DNA could identify and convict her killer. The new investigation began by finding out what evidence had survived.
We had items that were found in the barn, some items of her clothing, but importantly, what was missing was the oatmeal jumper that Yolandi was wearing at the time of her death. That was an item from which a bloodstain was found, which wasn't hers, and it was that bloodstain, the grouping from that bloodstain, which was used on the initial investigation to get the blood grouping with which to match against people from within the village.
As the only item belonging to Yolandi with someone else's blood on it, the missing jumper was a big blow.
There were another key items that still did exist, and it was those that we were able to submit to the forensic laboratories for further work to take place.
By January 2011, police managed to recover Yolandi's headband and a plastic fertilizer bag. Now it was up to the lab to find DNA not belonging to Yolandi.
We here at LGC have a cold case team that is dedicated just to cold cases. We'll use whatever available technology is there in order to try and help solve the case.
Locating the evidence was only half the battle. Usable DNA needed to be found.
One of the most important items was the polythene fertilizer bag that was found at the scene of the crime. Because the original note suggested there was blood on there, and obviously they'd got blood grouping results from that item. So we went back to it, and sure enough, there were still crusty bloodstains on that item. We then sampled some of those stains and carried out DNA profiling on them and got a good profile.
The lab was quick to give Thames Valley Police the news.
And they said that they had a profile. That profile, a DNA profile that is, that profile was then searched against the National DNA Database, and there was a match against David Burgess.
Already in prison for double murder, David Burgess was in the frame again. But it did pose the question, why hadn't he been a match when he was tested in 1966 or 68?
I would have expected him to match it if the test had been carried out correctly. And unfortunately, we can't go back and recheck that particular test, and we don't have any documentation in order to see whether there might have been a transcription error, a problem in moving information of the actual type onto another page that was used in a report, for example.
As far as the team were concerned, Burgess's blood had been incorrectly categorised in the 60s. But persuading a jury of this wouldn't be easy. They had to use the DNA to prove that the blood had always belonged to Burgess.
Although it was good evidence to have Burgess's DNA on that sack, the problem we had was that he was a local young man, would have had ready access to that barn, so we had to get evidence over and above that, because potentially he could have just said, yes, that's my DNA, I'm local, so what?
Roy Green and his team at LGC continued investigating the evidence.
As we looked through the old case notes that were prepared over 40 years previously, we noticed that one of them, the headband, had a description of it saying grubby, and that was it. But on examining the item, we found that what were thought to be grubby marks were actually blood. The DNA profiling results showed that there was a mixture of DNA on the headband. Some of it could have come from Yolandi, and that's to be expected because it was her item. But also, some of it could have come from David Burgess.
If Burgess's DNA was definitely on the headband, it would show that he'd come into direct contact with Yolandi. Police had to prove beyond any doubt that the DNA was his.
We had to refer to a specialist in genetic statistics at UCL, and he was able to say that, in his opinion, the DNA profile found on her headband was a 1 in a billion match probability to Burgess.
A 1 billion to 1 match was conclusive proof that Burgess and Yolandi had had physical contact. It was time to let the surviving members of Yolandi's family know what was happening.
I tend to try and only make contact with the family when we have new evidence, which hopefully will bring their case to a successful conclusion. In Yolandi's case, I approached Giles, her brother.
There wasn't a sort of sense of relief, a sense of... I can't say that I felt anything. It's a process, and it still feels as though it's a process, because it makes no difference to the end result. Yolandi is dead, never to be alive again. The bit that I was worried about was the impact it would have on my dad in his twilight days.
For the police, turning failed investigations around wasn't just about pride.
Each one of our undetected cases has obviously a victim, but and the victim's family. The impact on families is massive, in as much that it's difficult to comprehend what that family's gone through. And when we visit them sort of 10, 20, 30 years after the event, you can still see the impact, in as much that there's a picture of their loved one, either on a television, on a mantelpiece, and it never goes away. It's something that they think about every day.
My parents were certainly not wanting a repeat. Well, their trust in anybody disappeared, evaporated completely, for the simple reason that their precious daughter had been taken from them.
Pete Byrne and his team had to put together a case to back up the DNA.
It's really, really pleasing to get the forensic result, but that's just the start of it, really. From that moment on, we then have to look at the case and build the case up against Burgess.
Police had to painstakingly trawl through all the evidence from 1966 and find the original witnesses.
They were all seen, if they were still alive, interviewed, asked in relation to their initial statement whether they wanted to add, alter or correct anything in relation to what they'd said back in '66 to what they could remember in 2011.
In November 2011, the prime suspect in 17-year-old Nanny Yolandi Waddington's murder was interviewed about some of the original evidence from 1966 that had implicated him.
Did you get those scratches because Yolandi scratched your face?
I had nothing whatsoever to do with her death. I've told you that. And you won't believe it because I'm a liar, you said. We're saying the knife that you lost is identical. You say you lost. Is identical to the knife that was used to murder Yolanda Waddington. That's a coincidence, isn't it? Your missing knife is the same knife. How many people in Venham had a knife similar? How many people? Are they all suspects, aren't they?
Finally, Burgess was asked about his confession to prison guards.
And you thought it was safe to say that here?
No.
It was safe, wasn't it?
I'd never say something like that if I committed a murder. I wouldn't go around shouting about it.
After we finished interviewing Burgess and he was charged, we then carried on building the case up against him, putting the file in to the CPS, and then getting ready for the trial.
45 years after he'd first been the main suspect in Yolandi Waddington's brutal killing, David Burgess was going to stand trial for her murder.
It's not every day that you get told that your sister's murderer has just been arrested. It was a sort of sense of, wow, that's progress, and significant progress.
On the 18th of June 2012, David Burgess stood trial at Reading Crown Court.
I was confident in the results that we'd obtained, but in the background there was always this mistyping of the original blood grouping results that could be a potential stumbling block.
If the defence could sway the court into believing there was no way that the two blood tests done on Burgess in the 60s could have been wrong, he'd get off the murder of Yolandi yet again. It was a difficult time for Giles.
There is no provision whatsoever for, or any preparation that can prepare anybody for facing a trial as a victim's relative.
For David Burgess, it all seemed nothing more than an inconvenience.
I saw him throughout the trial. His attitude didn't seem to have changed at all from when we'd first interviewed him. He just simply appeared bored by the whole proceedings.
The jury and Giles were told all the grisly details.
The fact that she'd been found naked, her clothes had been strewn about, she'd been stabbed, she'd been strangled, the whole thing had been a sexual crime. And that's the bit that was uncomfortable because I found it out for the first time.
Through expert witnesses, the prosecution explained how the original blood tests must have been wrong, and more witnesses called.
One of the key points of the trial was a witness that we'd located in Australia who was living in Beanham just prior to the murder. She gave evidence to the effect that Burgess had attacked her one evening prior to the attack on Yolande. We were able to use that evidence, what's called bad character evidence, put that before the jury to show the type of man Burgess was.
Once all the witnesses found by Pete Byrne and his team had given evidence, there was only the DNA left.
We're fortunate that the scientist was able to explain to the jury in layman's terms what that DNA consisted of and how he was confident that the DNA that was found on the items belonged to Burgess.
In the end, everything relied upon the jury understanding the complex evidence.
The trial lasted 5 weeks in total. The jury were out for 5 days, after which they came back with an 11-1 majority verdict that Burgess was the killer.
On the 23rd of July 2012, almost half a century after Yolande Waddington's murder, David Burgess was sentenced to 27 years imprisonment. It was a huge relief to Giles.
For want of the better expression, shouted from the rooftops to say, no matter how old the crime, the resources are now there to provide justice now.
He should be 92 years of age when he's released. I don't think he should ever be released.
Burgess is clearly a sexually motivated repeat killer, and you do wonder how his killing career would have been progressing had he not been caught. But as a fledgling serial killer, and that's what he is, I'm glad that at least he was nipped in the bud.
We're very, very pleased that we got the result. But that's what me and my team do. We reinvestigate the historic cases that are unresolved.
Burgess was sent back to prison, but questions were raised about the 18 months he'd been on the run.
We made sure that forces were also made aware that there was a convicted killer that potentially could have committed offences anywhere within the UK within that time, so we passed on his details to other forces.
By the time Burgess is eligible for parole, he will have spent 73 years behind bars. For the 3 murders the police know he's committed. The question is, are there more?
Join the team and face the day-to-day struggle of stamping out crime. Leave it to the experts, Saturday at 10 in the Force Northeast.
Dog walkers came across the bin bags.
They find this is a disposal of some body parts.
The brutality of it, it was unbelievable.
It's what the psychos do.
It was a massive shock to everybody. Things don't happen like that in a community like this.
People just couldn't believe it. Obviously, it makes you scared.
You think, is there a serial killer on the loose? Is this gang-related?
And I got a phone call, and then my world fell apart. They were new, but I didn't know there was anything wrong.
Just south of Manchester, at the start of the River Mersey, sits Stockport.
Well, there's a lot of history with Stockport. There's a church behind here that goes 16th century.
Stockport's quite a quiet town. I grew up there, I was born there, raised there, went to school there, and there was a sense of community and people rallying round. If anything happens, there's a lot of support there, and if you're from Stockport, people sort of stick together from there.
People are very friendly, very nice, very approachable.
On the outskirts of Stockport, nestled amongst the serene surroundings of a leafy country park, is Brinnington.
I think Bridlington's an absolutely fantastic place to live. Everybody is a big family. Everybody looks out for each other, and it is a very tight-knit community.
For those wanting an escape from the hustle and bustle of nearby Stockport, locals can soak up the nature in Reddish Vale Country Park.
The Vale, it is a lovely place. We used to go out, we used to climb up the trees. It's just a kid's wildest dreams, isn't it? You can do what you want when you're down the Vale.
You get quite a lot of people fishing down there. A lot of people down there with the dogs and running and things like that. It's lovely, it's really nice.
But the tranquility of this country park was shattered one summer's morning.
It was all in lockdown, and so my granddaughter, she used to walk the dog for us every couple of days. And one day she came back. She said, just going down, she said, there was a big bag of meat there, Gran. Like bin bag, and it was all ripped open. I said, oh, so you didn't let our dog touch it, did you? She said, no, no, no. I wouldn't let her touch it. She went trying to sniff at it, but I just pulled her back. She said it didn't look very good, it was all green. She said, I think it was something from a butcher's. So, didn't think anything more about it.
But moments later, another dog walker grows suspicious.
Dog walkers came across the bin bags. They called into the police and reported, you know, that these bags had been found.
Dog walker walking in here sees a black bag and the dog's worrying the black bag. As soon as they open it, they can smell the bad smell. It will be a case of, I think, of what do I do now? And I expect the thing is to ring the police.
Alerted to the scene by a putrid smell coming from the bags, police inspect them, only to make a horrific discovery.
They find this is a disposal of some body parts.
Having identified some human remains in the bags, police secure the scene, and a murder investigation is immediately launched.
So the police officer turns up to the scene, finds parts of a body. Straight away, they'll be thinking, preservation, let's get some specialist teams down here. They've got to then put a cordon in the area so that nobody can come in and take pictures and disturb the scene. Most police officers will have seen dead bodies, but it's an entirely different kettle of fish, isn't it, when you're seeing a body cut up.
News of the shocking discovery quickly spreads, and local reporters rush to the scene.
There was a massive sense of urgency with this. We cover a lot of murders in Manchester, but nothing like this. We were just trying to establish what had happened. All that we knew was that a body's been found, dismembered, in bin bags in a country park. That was just, it was unbelievable at the time.
As the story spreads, the local community struggles to come to terms with what's been found on their doorstep.
It was a massive shock to everybody. Things don't happen like that in a community like this. You know, how could somebody do that? It's absolutely horrific.
It rocked the community, the brutality of it. It shocked a lot of people.
People just couldn't believe it, you know. Obviously it makes you scared, especially if it's just around the corner from where you live.
The shock of it just got about. It was just like it was more like when a rumour gets about. How do you drop a bag on the Vale with a human body in it? Do you know what I mean? It's what the psychos do.
News of the crime spreads fast, but the most important question on everyone's lips is, who is the victim?
The police will not know who that victim is at that moment. The family of that individual will not know that their loved one has died. So the police would have been looking at the missing persons register, because it's important to try and get to the family of that individual as quickly as possible.
But there's a problem. The bags contain only certain body parts, making an initial identification impossible. And it spreads fear amongst families in the local community.
For the residents, it was a very, very difficult situation. You might have people whose parents, daughters, sons didn't come home for one reason or the other. So they were even worried that it could have been their loved one.
The police have no idea who their victim is and are no closer to knowing who could have possibly carried out this sickening crime.
The police will be trying to find the crime scene, because where the body is, the person has probably not been murdered there. They've just been parts of their body dumped there. You think, is there a serial killer on the loose? Is this gang related?
In the Stockport suburb of Brinnington, the community is waking up reeling after bin bags containing body parts were discovered in the local country park.
It's unusual to have a body dismembered. I can only think of 2 or 3 in my service in Greater Manchester.
Massive shock to everybody. You don't expect something like that to happen on your doorstep.
I've never heard anything like it before in my life. I couldn't believe it.
With the fears in the community growing, police specialists move in to examine the area.
There is an urgency taking place. It's like a huge juggernaut moving. They call it the golden hour, and it isn't an hour. It's the time that you're going to get the best evidence and the best opportunities to catch the killer and get main lines of inquiry. You will have police forensic teams sent out to the scene. You will have scientists looking at blood pattern analysis, looking at body deposition. The coroner from the area will be called out. So there's a whole group of people that are going to get involved in this from a very early stage.
News of the gruesome discovery has spread like wildfire, and local reporters are on the scene. But while forensic officers have the delicate task of trawling the crime scene, in a bid to identify the victim, the cause of death, and find clues to the killer, the media frenzy threatens to scupper the investigation from the off.
It's difficult for the police to keep ahead of the media frenzy. The media, they can be down and they can be knocking on doors in the area. They want to get in there and get the story.
We sent a reporter down there. We spoke to the community, we spoke to neighbours, and then we sent a photographer down there as well.
Photos from the scene are shared online, much to the concern of investigators.
When it got put on Facebook, that's how most people really did find out through that.
One of the big issues for investigators at a crime scene like this is media and social media. Everybody wants to take photographs. Everybody wants to pass that out. It can be around the world, and let's say it takes 3 days to identify that individual because there's got to be some scientific analysis. Well, the family might have been looking at this for days on end.
With the images spreading online, time is running out before news gets to the family.
There's a number of ways that the police can try and identify an individual. It's been perfected over the years. You've got fingerprints, you've got tattoos, marks, you've got dental, you've got DNA.
Now we're into the phase of looking at that body in detail for marks, for injuries, things like that. As you carry on and dissect to look for evidence, this is all about the detail of what that body is telling you.
After examining the remains, experts find a tattoo on one of the body parts. Could this be key to identifying the victim? Then, suddenly, 9 hours after the discovery, police receive a call, reporting a local resident missing. She is 46-year-old Yvonne McCann, known as Vonnie.
The first thing, obviously, we realise that my sister's missing. And then the second thing we see on Facebook is that body parts have been found. So then you're putting 2 and 2 together, aren't you?
Yvonne's sister, Helen, had been watching the police drama unfold before her eyes, unaware of the devastating impact it was about to have on her life.
I sat in my garden, looking at the police on the Vale, texting my sister. What's going on? It looks really bad. What's going on? Have you heard anything, Von? I didn't get any response, but I didn't think anything of it. Didn't even know she was missing.
Police request that one of Yvonne's family head to the scene to establish whether the victim is indeed their loved one or someone else entirely.
One of my nephews had been up to see a body part with a tattoo on it, so that proved that it was our Yvonne. I was shocked. I was empty. I had no feelings. I didn't have a tear in my eye. I couldn't cry. I think I was just in disbelief and shock. The way we lost her, the way she was found, the indignity of being found like that.
Early hours of the morning, we'd gone to bed and I got a phone call off my brother Charlie saying they think that's our Yvonne. And then my world fell apart. I was meant to protect her. They knew, but I didn't know. Didn't know there was anything wrong.
News that one of their own has been taken from them hits locals hard.
The whole community was subdued for a few weeks, to be honest, because everybody knew Vonnie. When you normally pass somebody and you say hi to them and then suddenly they're not there to say hi to, it was very, very tragic, very tragic.
Yvonne was well known to locals, having lived in Brinnington her whole life.
She was the youngest, you know, she's the apple of my dad's eye, shall we say. She was a lovely girl. She's very mischievous. She was loud, she was bright, she had a great sense of humour, you know, and she was good fun to be with.
She was a baby. She got away with stuff that me and my brother never did. I think they give up. After me and my brother, they must have given up. She used to drive me nutty when we got to the teenage stage, and she used to run after me all the time and want to hang about with me. She was just funny. I wish she could hang about with me now. But at the time, you don't think of that, do you?
During her teenage years, Yvonne found her first love with local lad Thomas McCann.
Yvonne and Thomas were definitely childhood sweethearts. She was about 14 when she met Tommy. From there, she was just always with Tom. Tom was the man.
She was 14 when she met him and he was a few years older. They were both devoted to each other.
A lot of people meet at a young age, and sometimes your first love is just your first love and you grow apart. Well, they never grew apart, they just grew stronger.
In 1996, 8 years into their relationship, Yvonne and Thomas tied the knot and started a family together.
Yvonne had 3 children with Thomas. They were married and Thomas was a family man, hard-working man. He worked as a takeaway delivery driver in Stockport.
She loved him to bits, and he loved her. And they stayed together for all them years because there was a strong bond between them.
However, in 2012, after 24 years together, the relationship sadly came to an end. Yet Yvonne and Thomas remained friends and continued to live under the same roof. And eventually, Yvonne started dating again.
She moved on to a new relationship and things appeared to go well.
He's a nice bloke and he wanted to look after her. He made her feel good.
Life for Yvonne was good. But in March 2020, during the UK's period of lockdown, she moved back in with Thomas, who she was still on friendly terms with, in order to spend more time with her children. But in May 2020, just hours before a planned family barbecue, Yvonne texts family to say she's not coming, and then disappears, prompting her worried ex Thomas to take matters into his own hands.
At that point, Thomas reported that she was missing.
So what could possibly have led this well-known mother to be killed in such a horrific way?
When a body is dismembered, As an investigator, you've got to look at why it's been dismembered. So in this case, it's put in black bin liners and discarded on a park. It's not a case of trying to hide the body. That seems to me to be a knee-jerk reaction. This person doesn't know what they want to do with the body. You know, this is not a criminal mastermind. This didn't look like some kind of serial killer. It's not gang-related where they've taken some time, like you see on some of the films. It is a quick, hurried deposit of some body parts.
Police now begin to suspect that whoever was responsible for this sickening crime was local to the area.
One of the things I thought about on this is there's some science behind where criminals operate. You, I, everybody else will have an area where we operate a daily business. We'll go to the same pubs, we'll go to the same shops, we'll meet the same friends at the same locations. And if you look at that, this is how criminals operate. Because they'll carry out the crime, they'll know places where they feel that they can deposit stuff and they can get away and not be compromised.
With Yvonne's home a mere stone's throw from where her body was found, attention falls on her inner circle.
You want to be with the families very quickly. One, for that reassurance, but secondly, to identify, have they got any idea of how it occurred, who could have done it, or was it within the family? You want to look at possible partners, friends, and people that they've had arguments with. That gives me a smaller pool of people to look at than trying to look at every gang member in Greater Manchester to see whether they've killed this woman.
Police begin by speaking to Yvonne's ex-husband, Thomas McCann. Thomas tells police that he last saw Yvonne on the Saturday morning, 2 days before her body was found. She left home to meet her new partner. Detectives speak to him, but he tells them that Yvonne never turned up. And after some delving into his whereabouts on the day, police rule the new partner out of the investigation. So where had Yvonne gone? And who would want her dead?
We didn't know if she'd just had an argument and gone to her boyfriend. We didn't know if she'd had an argument and gone to see a friend. You know what I mean? We didn't know.
As Yvonne's family prepare to say their goodbyes, suddenly police make an announcement.
A man has been arrested on suspicion of murder after a woman's body was found on Reddish Vale Country Park earlier this morning. The suspect has been taken into custody and detained for questioning.
It was a big shock to everybody. Nobody ever expected it at all.
It's been a matter of hours since human remains were found in Brinnington, and the body has been identified as that of 46-year-old mum, Yvonne McCann, and police have made an arrest.
One of my nephews knocked on his door and says, I've come to tell you my dad's been arrested for a murder.
Yvonne's ex-husband, 49-year-old Thomas McCann, is arrested and taken into police custody.
It's unfathomable to even think something like that could happen.
And as Yvonne's loved ones try to make sense of this shocking news, the community rallies together to show its support.
Our family's a very well-known family. We were born and bred Brinnington, so it affected everybody. It wasn't just the family, the estate. It affected the estate. People couldn't believe it, you know, and the response, the messages of people, and we had lockdown here. We had lockdown. And even in lockdown, there must have been 300 people on this front. And by the way, they was all trying their best to stay safe. But how can you stop 300 people coming to show their respects?
Despite the incredible support from the local community, the interrogation of Yvonne's ex-husband Thomas in connection with her death continues. So what had led to the arrest of the father of 3 of Yvonne's children? Police had recently learnt that on Saturday morning, 2 days before Yvonne's body was found, there had been an argument between Yvonne and Thomas.
Yvonne and Thomas had argued in the morning. The neighbours had heard them arguing from about 9 o'clock.
They had an argument over a bag of chips, apparently.
She'd messaged her neighbour saying, you know, I've left a bag of frozen chips out. And that was that.
While in custody, Thomas tells police that after the argument over the frozen chips, Yvonne left their home to go and see her new partner. He then tells police the following day he was invited to a family barbecue.
Both him and Yvonne had been invited to a family barbecue by their son. And Yvonne, she'd messaged her son saying she wouldn't go. And there'd been an argument, and there was a few messages exchanged to do with that.
Yvonne's texts made it clear she didn't want to join Thomas at the barbecue, but he still went and stayed there until late in the evening.
He went to walk home. His daughter was helping him home because he was drunk. He passed out. And then that's when his daughter found the rings and, I believe, her mobile phone in his jacket pocket and began questioning where her mum was.
When confronted by his daughter, Thomas explains why he had Yvonne's possessions with him. And he gives a different story to the one he initially gave to the police.
After, you know, they'd had this argument, he said he met her on Hempshire Lane, which is in Stockport. He said he was going to give her a lift to the new partner's house, and during which she gave him her wedding rings for safekeeping. And that her phone had fallen into the footwell of his car, so he'd got those off her and then dropped her off at the new partner's house.
Her phone and rings were found in his pocket, so that heightens the senses of the SAO that this might be the individual we're looking at.
But the police still have no hard evidence to link Thomas to the crime.
I would be getting a search warrant for that property. You'd want to do a forensic examination in the home. One of the first things I'd be doing when I went in the house would be getting the bath and the plumbing looked at, because there'll be residue in the bath and there'll be residue in the pipes all the way down to the plumbing.
Officers searched Thomas and Yvonne's address, but forensics failed to find anything incriminating.
The house was spotless. From what I can gather, there was nothing found DNA-wise, there was nothing found there in the house that could prove that anybody had been killed in that house.
With no forensic evidence found at the address, police scour local CCTV in an attempt to confirm whether Thomas had indeed travelled to Stockport to meet Yvonne on the Saturday.
Thomas gives an explanation of where he went between certain times. The teams will look at any CCTV to see whether they confirm his story, because what you're trying to do is you're either trying to confirm or deny what he's saying.
And in a major breakthrough, police do uncover CCTV focusing on the street outside Yvonne and Thomas's home. But there's no sign of Yvonne leaving the address at any point. Despite Thomas's insistence to police that she'd walked out after the pair had argued over frozen chips.
It was 9 to 10 o'clock in the morning. He was seen going outside 4 times, moving things from his truck. Why he was doing that, we don't know. But then from about 10 o'clock, he was inside the house. And then he wasn't seen again until 4 o'clock.
Having spent the day indoors, Thomas McCann is seen leaving the address. But it's what he's seen carrying which really sparks police interest.
Thomas McCann left the house with bin bags.
Has Thomas been caught red-handed on CCTV carrying his ex-wife's remains? Further examination of the cameras shows Thomas returns home at 10:47 p.m. and heads out again just before 1 a.m. Shortly after leaving, his car is spotted on CCTV, parked at Bredbury Recycling Centre on the outskirts of Stockport. Police immediately dispatch officers to the scene.
It was at the recycling centre where more body parts were found.
The body parts are quickly identified as those of Yvonne McCann. Tools, including a Stanley knife, are also discovered at the scene. And Thomas is confronted with the damning evidence against him.
The officers have asked him the questions, he's given him an answer, they've gone away, they've come back and said, come on Thomas, that's not right. And here you are with a load of bin liners. What were you disposing of and where did you take him? People do become upset. A lot of them become angry because they're being found out. The story isn't right. The true craft of an interviewer is to get a person talking. If you can get that rapport going with that individual, you can get that little chink, you know, you need to do this for your kids, you need to do this for her. It can turn it. And that's the true craft of turning somebody to talk to you.
There was 4 police interviews. At the 4th interview, when he was accompanied by a solicitor, he handed in a statement saying, "I've killed my wife, I've killed Yvonne and disposed of her like garbage."
Thomas McCann is charged with the murder of his ex-wife, Yvonne McCann.
You think, it's something that doesn't happen to you. It's something that doesn't happen in your family. It's something that happens in America. Do you understand what I'm saying? It doesn't happen in Brinnington. Something like that doesn't happen on your doorstep, and it definitely doesn't happen to your sister.
But the question troubling the police is the motive. Why would Thomas murder his childhood sweetheart and mother of his children? Four days since the human remains of Yvonne McCann were found in a park near the Stockport suburb of Brinnington, the community wakes to the shocking news that her ex-husband, 49-year-old delivery driver Thomas McCann, has confessed to her murder.
Yvonne and Thomas were childhood sweethearts, which I think makes it all the more surprising that this happened, really.
He's not only killed his wife, he's also mutilated her body as well. How anybody could do that, I'll never know.
Ten months after Yvonne's murder, Thomas appears at Manchester Crown Court to enter a formal plea. And the question the family are desperate to be answered is, why did Yvonne's once-loving husband end her life in such a brutal way? Could it really be over a bag of frozen chips?
This was the first that anyone had heard the proper details of the case, and it was the first time in open court that the public would hear of the details of the case, so it was a very tense atmosphere. There was the family sat upstairs in the public gallery at the back, and then Thomas McCann in the dock. Thomas seemed really normal when I saw him in court. He was in a blue suit, he looked quite smart. You wouldn't look at him to think he'd done something like that, but you could say that about any murderers, couldn't you?
My side of the family, we weren't in the same courtroom because of COVID. We wasn't allowed. We was by camera.
I never went to court. I didn't want him to see me, because if he sees me and I show any emotion at all, he's won.
Thomas formally pleads guilty to the murder of his ex-wife, meaning he wouldn't have to give a defence revealing any motive for the killing.
I think Thomas pleaded guilty to stop his family from hearing all the gory details of what went on. That way he didn't have to tell his side of the story.
He knew that a few of the family were going to go to court, so he pleaded guilty, so there wasn't a court case. No one even had a say on the matter.
With Thomas pleading guilty to the crime, the family is denied hearing a motive for the murder. Could the answer lie in their 24-year relationship, which started when they met as teenagers?
I think she just fell head over heels with him. And I think, oh, this is a fairy tale. But it wasn't a fairy tale. Every couple of months we used to say, oh, is Thomas still at home? Going off with every woman he set eyes on. And she'd forgive him over and over and over again.
No matter what you said to her, Bonnie, she wouldn't believe it. My Thomas wouldn't do that. My Thomas wouldn't do that.
Over the years, the strain of the relationship took its toll on Yvonne, and she reached out to her brother and sister for help.
We all said, it'll never be no good. And she used to just fall to pieces. And we used to pick the pieces up. And in the end, you know, you can't keep saying, leave him, because it doesn't work. She had to be ready to do that.
My sister come round, our Yvonne, and said, you know, can you go and chuck him out, or can you go and have a word with him, can you sort it out? Now, I used to do that for her. Nothing ever involved violence, just strong talking. But you knew you was wasting your time, because within a day or two, he'd be back. So after maybe 10 years of actually trying to sort it out, I did say to our Yvonne, you know, if you have trouble now, don't come to see me. When you want him gone, get him gone yourself.
Yvonne remained with Thomas. But as the years rolled on, she became more and more vulnerable.
She was a very mentally strong person, don't get me wrong, but, you know, as time went on, she got weaker and weaker as things went wrong. You know, dogs dying, parents dying. When my mum died, she believed a lot in ghosts, our Yvonne, and afterlife. She used to go and see psychics and things like that. All of a sudden, all sorts of little things are moving around. You've got all your ornaments and things like that are moving around. Things are appearing from nowhere. And Yvonne's thinking, it's my mum and my dad, you know. And it wasn't my mum and dad, it was Thomas messing around with her head. I think that's exactly what he was doing.
As far as I'm aware, there was nothing physical. There was no physical abuse, but there was something. I think it was like mental torture to her.
Eventually, in 2012, Yvonne built up the strength to end her relationship with Thomas.
She'd had enough, and she wanted out. So she moved out, she moved away from the trouble.
Yvonne then met her new partner. But despite this, Thomas kept a tight grip on Yvonne.
Thomas wouldn't let go. You know, he'd threatened to jump off bridges, things like that. If you don't stay with me, I'm going to jump off this bridge. If you don't stay with me, I'm going to drink this bleach. If you don't stay with me, I'm going to take these tablets.
He was stood on the bridge numerous times near where she lived, threatening to jump. He went disappearing one time. He just disappeared. And then he turned up again. And I think it was constant mind games.
Despite recently moving in with her new partner, Yvonne, concerned over Thomas's well-being, felt she had no choice but to move back in with her ex-husband.
She went back, but she didn't want to be there. She wanted that fresh start. She wanted that fresh start, and she wasn't allowed that fresh start. She couldn't get rid of him. He wouldn't go. That is what happened towards the end.
In March 2020, the COVID-19 pandemic hit the UK, and a national lockdown meant that Yvonne and Thomas would be spending more time together than usual.
All of a sudden, you're stuck in the same house together for months. It's going to have effects on some people. For our Yvonne to be spending all that time with Thomas, I don't think it would have been a good thing, you know.
2 months into lockdown, Yvonne pays her brother a visit, which tragically would be the last time he saw her.
The last time I spoke to her was the Thursday before she was murdered. She come round the house, and Yvonne was talking to my wife and saying, you know, he's going through my phone. I wake up in the night or in the morning, he's sat at the end of the bed looking at me. She said, I don't feel comfortable. She knew herself that there was something not right with him. And in that conversation, she actually said to me that if I am ever found dead, it's him that's done it. And that was words out of her mouth the Thursday before the day she disappeared. If I am ever found dead, it's him that's done it.
Days later, on the morning of Saturday the 23rd of May 2020, a neighbour hears an argument coming from Yvonne and Thomas's home. They then receive a text from Yvonne saying the pair were arguing over frozen chips being left out. But was this really the motive for the murder?
All I can think is that I'd lost control of her. Maybe they had the conversation and she said, well, I am going. Maybe that's what triggered it off. Maybe she decided, right, Tom, I'm going, and he thought, well, you're not going anywhere. Makes more sense to me than arguing over a bag of chips. Certainly does. He's the only one that knows.
The motive may be unclear, but police discover what Thomas did next. And it's truly horrifying.
He strangled Yvonne, and then, we believe using a Stanley knife and some lopping shears, he dismembered the body. I think that's what took so long for him to do. That's why he was in the house for so long.
Police also discover that after killing his ex-wife, Thomas had used Yvonne's phone pretending to be her.
So whilst he was dismembering Yvonne's body, he was messaging the family using her phone, messaging himself using her phone and replying. He was apologising to her about the bag of frozen chips, telling her he still loved her. All this was carried on whilst he was committing that act.
So he's trying to manufacture a narrative there, so that when he's asked questions, say, oh, well, I was speaking to her at these times, and then these are messages, and if she's died before then, well, she died afterwards.
The court hears that in a prepared statement, McCann had told police he had strangled Yvonne and cut her body up in order to make her go away. He then disposed of her body parts and the tools he had used, and then shockingly joined his family for a barbecue that his son had invited both parents to attend the next day.
He didn't show any remorse. How can that be remorseful? Just carrying on after he murdered and dismantled my sister. Carrying on like he'd done nothing. Or just go and have a barbecue with my family. Just carry on pretending I'm my wife on her phone. No, that wasn't sorry. Can say sorry as much as he wanted in court to the family. That shows me he was never sorry.
The court is also told that only 50% of Yvonne's body has ever been found.
Other parts of the body were still not found. They've not found the head.
The family will never get complete closure in that aspect until she's returned as a whole. There's always that part of my loved one is still out there, and hopefully one day it'll be found.
On the 30th of March 2021, the judge imposes his sentence. Thomas McCann is sentenced to life in prison, with a minimum of 12 years behind bars.
My side of the family just got up and walked out. I was gobsmacked.
There was a number of things which reduced the sentence. Part of it was reduced due to his guilty plea. Another part was due to mitigating circumstances such as his mental state at the time. He had mental health issues. There was alcohol abuse there. From what we know, he suffered with horrendous abuse as a child in every way imaginable. But you'd think a brutal murder like that, the way he disposed of the body, you know, people who've murdered people in the past have got much higher sentences for doing a lot less than what he did.
What's that message about 12 years sent out to other people that are thinking of getting rid of the wife because they've had enough of her, eh? Can't afford to divorce her, can't do this, I'll murder her. I'll get 12 years. It's disgusting, absolutely disgusting. They should be ashamed of themselves.
I could never forgive him. Never. He took my sister away. He took a part of me away with him that day, and a part of my brother as well.
I could never forgive him for what he's done to not just me, the family. It's what he's done to everybody. It's up to him now to do something with himself. It's up to him to realise what he's done and let him do his time. But when it comes to forgiveness, no, I can't forgive the man. No, I can't. No.
With Thomas now behind bars, the community of Brinnington struggles to come to terms with the horror of what happened to Yvonne.
The neighbours, everybody, even now still feel it. Because obviously, you know, children left without a mum, and it's just thrown their life, probably for the rest of their lives, into turmoil. Very, very sad, very sad.
And Yvonne's elder siblings are slowly coming to terms with a life without her.
The way of moving on is to keep yourself busy. Don't let things get into your head. We're not going to let him destroy my life, my wife's life, my family's life, my kids' life. We're not going to let him do it. We're going to get on and we're going to be even stronger. And that's how you get through things.
I'll never be able to understand why she's no longer here. And the nightmares, the constant lack of sleep since, wondering who she was shouting for while he was strangling her, because she'd have been shouting for somebody to help her. And we didn't, and we couldn't, because we didn't know.
There's more shocking true crime Wednesday at 9 on Sky Mix, when a victim of circumstance is in the wrong place at the wrong time in New Murdered at First Sight.
If you have been affected by any of the issues raised in this programme, help is available online at sky.com/viewer support.
I don't think, I've never heard anybody say a wrong word about her. Didn't seem to me like she's got any enemies in the world.
Cheshire Fire and Rescue received a call of multiple fires at the property.
News of a devastating fire in the Cheshire countryside.
Once those fires had died down, there was no sign of her.
Where is the owner, and are they safe?
When the deceased is found, clearly the state of the body, how it's been found, clearly a murder from the off.
I can't believe anybody would treat Diane like that.
Police believe she was murdered and then her home deliberately set alight.
In the middle of the Cheshire countryside lies a quiet, quaint hamlet. Cranage.
It's quite an affluent area in parts. There's some big houses. There's a lot of farms around there, quite isolated at parts, and dairy farms, chicken farms. As well as being quite small, there's obviously the classic community feel towards it, whereby everybody knows everyone, and that's pretty much central to a place like Cranage.
The area is a really desirable place to live. I mean, a lot of people with a lot of money want to come and share what we've got out here. You know, we've got quite a lot of famous footballers in the area.
It's a lovely area, and it's just a nice area to live.
In the heart of the village sits Parklands Cattery, run by popular local Diana Lee.
Diane was a lovely girl that would always help people out. Very, very conscientious, very bright. You never saw her without a smile on her face. She was always very bubbly and just a lovely person. I'd never heard anybody say a wrong word about her.
She was always such a lovely lady, very full of the joys of spring, and didn't seem to me like she's got any enemies in the world. You know, she's that type of really likeable person.
Originally from Tabley, Diana moved to Cranage in 2008 and opened her own cattery business. And it thrived.
Diana opened the business with an ex-partner at the property and had been quite successful in doing so. That partner then left that business and she continued to run the cattery on her own.
But Parklands wasn't just any cattery. It was the creme de la creme of the feline world.
She loved cats and that's why she created the business that she did do, which was probably a little bit unique to Cheshire and this environment. So offering TVs and beds, sort of prices at probably slightly higher than maybe other areas of the country. So, yeah, I mean, that showed probably her caring side more than anything else.
I think anybody that wanted to trust anybody with an animal, you'd only have to be in the presence of Diane for a few minutes and you'd soon be contented the mind that your animal would be in safe hands and well looked after, well cared for, because she's just that caring nature.
Diana lived in a large gated detached property next door to her cattery, but she didn't live alone.
Being a big property at Parklands, Diana had a lodger who lived with her at that time, probably a bit of company and also to help with the income coming in and to upkeep such a large property and the business as well.
On the 8th of August 2012, Diana meets friends for dinner, something which she often does in her spare time.
Diana met up with some friends in Knutsford at the Man's End Chinese restaurant on King Street, where she spent the evening with them.
She got a lot of friends, Diane had, and she'd be out with different groups of friends quite a lot.
But little does Diana know, that evening with friends is to change life forever and leave a lasting scar on the close-knit community.
11 a.m, Cheshire Fire and Rescue received a call of multiple fires at a property in Cranage.
This scene was discovered through a family relative going to the address. They go to the house, they see fire coming from, smoke coming from the house and the garage. A neighbour was alerted who rang the fire brigade.
Emergency services arrive and work tirelessly to put out the fire.
Once those fires had died down and they'd been treated with, they'd realised that Diana's car wasn't at the property and there was no sign of her.
That's the main concern for the police, would be where is the owner and are they safe? The police have got a report of a fire. You've got a relative who's turned up who can't find the owner. Clearly there's a number of seats of fire. Straight away you'd be thinking there's something suspicious regarding this, particularly if you're looking at an affluent property like we've got here.
The fire experts are going to be looking at whether it's a deliberately set fire, whether it appears to be an electrical fire, whether it's potentially a chip pan that's gone over, and as soon as the idea that a fire has been deliberately set, everyone's mind goes into very suspicious.
Fire officers keep searching the property grounds and enter the adjacent garage. And what they find changes the course of the investigation.
They found her body at the property, and at that point, police were called to investigate.
When Diana's body was discovered, the most obvious thing that would be clear to the first attenders is that the body was, certainly on the surface, badly burnt. That raises a whole number of possible scenarios. An accident, misadventure.
Cheshire police immediately arrive at the scene.
In the time I've served in the police as an investigator, I've been involved with many inquiries. The early priorities are the scene, first scene where the victim is.
But it's where Diana's body is that raises suspicion. She is found lying face down on a wheelbarrow. She is naked, covered in shredded paper and bedding. Her body battered with horrific injuries.
When the deceased is found, clearly the state of the body, how it's been found, is clearly a murder from the off.
Police believe the extent of the injuries are not just caused by the fire, so a murder investigation is launched.
The most important thing is to preserve the scene. The slightest disturbance of a scene, by trampling through it, walking through it innocently, it causes contamination. So it's really, really important to make sure that it's cordoned off.
You only get one go at recovering evidence from a body, and one that is already compromised. There will be a lot of discussion about what should be sampled at the scene, what should be done at the scene, what is going to be compromised by another action. So there will be a lot of effort going into preserving as much evidence as possible.
News of the shocking crime spreads quickly through the close-knit community.
I can't believe anybody would treat Diane like that and do so much harm. It just seems horrendous. I just can't comprehend it.
In the quiet, quaint village of Cranage, the community is shocked at the news of a murder. But the previous evening, August 8th, started off like a normal night out for 54-year-old Diana Lee. At 8 p.m, Diana met up with friends and had dinner in a local Chinese restaurant. According to friends, she said goodbye to them at 10:15 p.m. before driving home. Early the following morning, Diana sent a text to a friend.
Diana's phone records on the morning of her death showed that she'd texted a friend saying she wasn't feeling very well, she's feeling sick, and that she'd like her to collect a cat later in the day.
But just a few hours later, her property was engulfed in flames.
Fire brigade and the police attend, and they find the horrible scene in the garage of the victim.
She was found dead in her home, and police had opened a murder investigation.
News of the horrific attack quickly spreads.
A call came through from a contact who had been driving past the area saying there was lots of activity in Cranage itself, so we decided to come down. When we came down here, it was essentially fire, pumps, as well as emergency services, police and ambulance as well. Whenever you have a scene of maybe 3 or 4 police vehicles and 4 fire engines, you know that something's pretty serious. The tape was quite high up. They'd sort of cordoned off here, and it was difficult to get any closer than this, really. But obviously, there's lots of residents coming down here, trying to find out what had been taking place.
And the quiet village of Cranage is now the centre of an atrocious crime, and fear spreads that there's a killer on the loose.
The feeling in the community was just of absolute shock, a disbelief that, I mean, things like murders don't happen around here.
I think from the outset, it was shock more than anything, and for it to happen for these residents on what is their doorstep was probably a big shock to them.
The fears for a community is who would do such an awful crime, and they're still out there. Could they strike again?
There was a real lack of understanding of that somebody could do this.
The question crossing the community's mind: who could have murdered Diana, and why?
Certainly, any murder, there's rumour and speculation about the victim and possible the motive for a murder or who could have done it.
Some murders are spontaneous, a lot of it is finance. So you'd be looking at straight away what the lady does for a living, is the money owed, has it just been a random targeted attack by some local or someone travelling?
Police need to act fast, so they search the house. But they quickly come across a startling piece of evidence.
There was evidence of the victim's clothing in the lodger's bedroom and also a blood-stained knife which belonged to the lodger. So he's got access to the house, he's got access to the garage. He may have been in a relationship with this lady. So you've got to treat that individual as a suspect. You would have to arrest them.
With such obvious evidence potentially linking the lodger to the crime, police need to establish his movements in the hours Diana was last seen alive.
From their point of view, it's a case of trying to find out their background, where they were at the time of the incident, what they'd been up to, trying to find all sorts of reasons why they could have committed a crime such as this one.
The lodger tells detectives that he last saw Diana at 7:30 p.m. in the garden before she left in her car to have dinner with friends in Knutsford. He goes on to say that he left for work at 6 a.m. and remembers seeing Diana's car parked on the driveway. While police unpick the lodger's alibi to see if it stacks up, the team on the ground make a breakthrough discovery.
They found that Diana's car had been abandoned 10 miles away in Mobley. At that point, they'd also had reports from a taxi driver who had seen a man acting suspicious in the area, who'd also tried to torch the vehicle before running off.
A witness came forward, a taxi driver, to say that he'd seen someone trying to set fire to the car. He challenged the driver, and the driver made off on a bike, and then he's made off on field. So again, the push bike would be a scene, and there'd be searches going around that area.
Was this man Diana's lodger? And had he driven Diana's car 10 miles north? But while police gather evidence, another arrest is made.
It was a person who was known to Diana, who'd been an ex-partner, who had been convicted previously of a charge against her. He had convictions against Diana in terms of beating her.
There were two immediate suspects, two men who were in her life. So there was a lodger, and there was some circumstantial evidence that suggested that he was not all he said he was. And then there was a very violent ex who had actually been imprisoned for attacking her. So two quite strong suspects.
But police are soon able to confirm Diana's lodger was at work the entire day from 6 a.m, hours before the fire had started. He is released without charge. And with the items of evidence found in his room, detectives now suspect the lodger was set up for murder. But by who? With Diana's ex still in custody, police take a more in-depth look at him and his whereabouts.
The large proportion of domestic murders is sometimes it's an ex-partner. Clearly the ex-partner was a prime suspect very early on. The motive is he knows the victim, it's previous violent history towards the victim, so straight away you'd be alarm bells going.
We were all pretty convinced who'd actually done this.
The local community recalled Diana had once lived a life in fear from her ex.
Somebody that she'd known was banned from being in the area, and she knew that he'd been at the house. Certain things had moved, and she was petrified. And she gave me a call, and I went down to have a look to see if there was anybody there. I'd never seen anybody so petrified.
And the location of Diana's car further cements police suspicions. It was dumped between her house and that of her ex's.
For the investigating officers, realised that the car had been found in a location that was en route to the person, so it probably made sense in their minds that, again, he was the person who'd committed this crime.
Questioning of Diana's ex intensifies.
Is he still in contact? Where does he live? What were his movements for the day or the time of the murder? to eliminate them from the inquiry.
So after a couple of days of speaking to the person who they'd arrested, it quickly became apparent that that individual had a solid alibi.
With his whereabouts on the night of Diana's murder confirmed, her ex-partner is released. Having followed strong leads and had 2 potential suspects, detectives are back to square one.
It was a case whereby the police had to reappeal for information. It was a case of them having come across a bit of a dead end and having to start again to see who had committed this crime.
But post-mortem results come in and help police identify the cause of her death. Could this provide further clues to her attacker?
If somebody has died before a fire, then you will sometimes see soot in the mouth, you will sometimes see it as far as the larynx. But to get it down into the lungs, somebody has to be breathing, answer that vital question, was this person alive when the fire was burning? And you'll be seeing that she hasn't inhaled soot, she hasn't inhaled the products of combustion. All of this is pointing to her being dead and then set alight, rather than either a deliberate act by herself or some sort of strange accident with solvents. She died of head injuries, so there was clear evidence of bleeding in the head resulting from impacts. That is very different to what you see if there's simply damage to the head from it being heated in a fire.
Police now know Diana died before her lifeless body was dumped and the garage set alight, meaning the killer tried to cover his tracks.
DNA will be damaged by the heat that the fire produces, but certainly trace evidence, if one looks hard enough, it can be recovered.
Forensics locate a small amount of unknown DNA on Diana. And there's something else.
There's no self-defense wounds. That information from the pathologist would clearly indicate generally that she knew the person was there with consent in the property, and that they weren't expecting that trauma to be caused to them.
Detectives now believe Diana's killer was known to her, so need to delve into her private life and turn to the community for help.
Community's key to any murder inquiry because they're the eyes and ears, and they probably hold evidence what they don't know at the time.
I get the feeling, as you do in so many of these cases, that Diana was actually quite a vulnerable person. She was living alone. She was probably fairly happy, having come out of an abusive and violent relationship. She was building things up again.
Maybe the situation has arose where she was probably too trusting of somebody.
Friends express their concerns that perhaps all was not as it seemed in Diana's life.
I should imagine she was easily taken advantage of in a financial way because she was quite a wealthy lady. A few times when I saw her passing, she seemed like very troubled, as though she wasn't her usual self, and she was obviously hiding something that she was really concerned about, but she never really told me the full extent of it, and that was a bit of a worry for me, you know, what was going on with her. But I think most people would have realised something was not quite right, but because she was a private person, she didn't really explain to me exactly what was going on. And I just said to her, if you ever have any problems, you must report things if there's something you need to report. But she wouldn't tell me anything in detail or anything.
With those close to Diana unable to shed light on her private life, the investigation intensifies, and police expand their search, trawling through local businesses and residential CCTV on the night Diana was last seen alive.
CCTV is huge on any major incident and murder inquiry, whether it's from the local council's CCTV, the police ANPR cameras, and then people's own CCTV from shops, businesses and private CCTV. A lot of the houses in this area will have their own CCTV. And if you get a fleeting glance of a vehicle or a person, that is key to an inquiry to identify people who have been at the scene.
So for the police officers investigating this case, they had a bit of a break when they found the CCTV footage on King Street of Diana leaving the restaurant, but at the same time they were left slightly puzzled by her movements, which were caught on an ANPR camera, which saw her headed away from her home address in Cranage and towards the Altrincham area of Greater Manchester.
What the police couldn't account for is about 45 minutes in between her leaving her friends and arriving home. So that gap in time was something that the police really needed to find out. Where was she going? Who was she seeing? Who was she meeting? That 45 minutes for the police would have been absolutely crucial because nobody could explain where she'd gone, so there was something in Diana's life that the police didn't know about.
With this latest piece of information, police looked closely at Diana's phone records and noticed something suspicious.
So as the officers trawled through Diana's phone records, they found a number that she'd been communicating with on a regular occurrence, but had stopped doing so in January of that year.
Is another suspect in their sights?
That number belonged to a David Ryan, who lived in Hale in Greater Manchester.
It's been several weeks since local Diana Lee was found murdered in her home in Cranage. Police have questioned and released 2 men known to Diana, and 13 days after her body was discovered, police released an EFIT.
The police issued an EFIT of someone who they wanted to speak to. That individual was a person who was with the Corsa, which was seen trying to set fire to it and then made off on a push bike. It's really important that people try and recall what they were doing that day at that time, because they may have seen that offender leaving the scene.
With officers waiting for tip-offs from members of the public following the release of the EFIT, and having eliminated 2 suspects that are known to Diana, detectives have also been trawling through Diana's phone and have traced a mysterious phone number. Could this be a 3rd suspect? And who is this David Ryan? And how is he connected to Diana?
So as part of the police investigation, the officers went to David Ryan's house in Hale in Greater Manchester. They asked him how he knew Diana. He said in 2010 he had met her at a dancing club in nearby Bowden. He said that he had not met her since, and that was the only occasion when he had seen her.
He gives an account that he knew the lady, not well, but he knew her. He met her about 2 years ago at a local dance club, and that was it really, nothing intimate, that he just knew her as a fleeting acquaintance, and that's all he gave to the police.
At this point, officers took a DNA swab of his mouth just to eliminate him from their inquiries.
Despite this latest lead, police still have no suspect. So detectives start looking deeper into Diana's digital footprint.
One of the things they looked at was her financial transactions, and it was noted that were large sums of money missing or that couldn't be traced.
And officers at Cheshire Police found a substantial amount of money that had been withdrawn by Diana, I think circa £60,000, whereby they had no idea where that money had gone. Straight away, that gave them the lead in terms of trying to find out who that money had gone to.
The large withdrawals ring alarm bells for detectives, and there is no sign of where or who the money was transferred to. But with the investigation intensifying, suddenly police make an announcement.
A 47-year-old man has been arrested in connection with the murder of a Cranage businesswoman.
As the inquiry progressed on the 2nd of September, the police announced to the media that they've arrested a suspect for the murder of Diana Lee.
The man who was arrested is David Ryan, the man who Diana met at the dancing club in Bowden first in 2010.
it was a bit of a shock to us all, really.
It had only been 24 hours since David told detectives he had met Diana once. So how had he ended up in police custody?
The day after Mr. Ryan had been spoken to by the police and given his DNA sample, he called the police and said that he had further information, that he did know the victim, that he'd met the victim the night before the murder, and he'd had consensual sex in her car with him. So Mr. Ryan said that he was in a relationship with this lady. He'd been for some time. He'd done work at the house. He had a conservatory window glazing company that he'd done a lot of work at the house.
But why would David change his alibi?
There are lots of reasons why somebody would keep a relationship secret. Now, one of the reasons is that that person is in a marriage. No, things need to be kept quiet.
Clearly, his mind had been worrying about the DNA, that they'd taken the DNA sample, and that he would be linked to the victims. So what he's done is he's tried to say that we would find his DNA once it had been examined, that he'd had sex with the day before, that he knew her and he had sex with her in the car. But it doesn't automatically say that he's murdered her, but his DNA would be found on her.
Detectives acknowledge David's concern that his DNA would most likely be picked up on Diana from the night before. But they still need to rule him out as a suspect.
So the police will be doing a lot of work around this new suspect whilst he's in custody, of his background. The background showed that he was a failed businessman. He spent lots of money. He liked spending money. He was buying stuff, exotic items for himself, for his family. And that shows the sort of mentality of the individual. And then that clearly links to the problems financially. He was bankrupt, business-wise.
They found he was in a huge amount of debt. His business, which was a window and door conservatory business, had collapsed in June 2012. It was quite clear that he was struggling for money.
David's money issues raised suspicion. On one hand, he was bankrupt. On the other, he was spending large amounts. And he'd been in a secret relationship with Diana, whose own bank accounts recently showed large amounts of money vanishing.
Throughout that, there was instances of spending which didn't tally with what he had.
So you're building the picture of someone who's will probably go to any means to try and support himself financially, not do the basics in life of working hard and getting money, but to get it quickly.
Intense investigations into both Diana and David's financial transactions ensue, and it isn't long before a link is made.
The next stage was finding out that David Ryan had basically tricked Diana into investing tens of thousands of pounds of her own money into companies that just didn't exist. This has gone on for a period of time, and Diana had committed a large amount of money into these fake schemes.
Clearly, the victim was vulnerable in some respects, struck up a relationship with the offender. He would have thought probably she was a wealthy lady, she had money, he was in financial troubles, his business was going downhill, he owed money out, and she was probably a target for Mr. Ryan to take advantage of financially.
Forensic evidence is then uncovered, which appears to place David at the scene of the crime.
There was a footprint found at the scene of the murder in the victim's blood, so that would suggest and confirm that whoever was wearing that footwear was at the scene after the victim had been killed. And that footwear was the offender's footwear, Mr. Ryan, and the forensic evidence supported the fact that it was his footwear and couldn't have been no one else's.
And it appears David Ryan has been following the case closely.
Computer analysis of his computers at his house and his phone, and it was quite compelling evidence, circumstantially, that he'd been searching on Cheshire Police website about the murder, where the inquiry was up to.
Perhaps even aware time was running out.
Background checks by officers into Ryan's computer's history found that he'd searched for countries that had no extradition treaties with the UK.
Somalia was named, and a number of others. So clearly this is a man who wants to, or is thinking about leaving the country because he's done something wrong. This man is now trying a way out to disappear from the country, to get away from being arrested for this awful murder.
Police appear to have finally found their man. And by collating all their information on David, they piece together a timeline of a murder.
Diana had obviously left the Man's End restaurant in King Street in Knutsford.
And they know that her car was caught by the ANPR cameras driving away from her home.
From there, she'd gone to Hale in Manchester to see David Ryan in her car. She picked him up. They travelled back down to Cranage, whereby they spent the night. And then, obviously, in the early hours of the morning, for whatever happened and whatever reasons, Diana was murdered.
Having killed the person he's been having an affair with for almost 2 years, David then sets a scene.
So following the murder, Mr. Ryan decided to cover his tracks, planting evidence in the lodger's room, using a dagger, leaving it there that he'd used to commit the crime. He'd also then started to plant various fires around the house.
He tried to burn the body to try and get rid of forensic evidence.
The problem being that he found that where he'd started those fires, there wasn't enough oxygen for the fires to let hold. The fires just burnt themselves out, so they didn't have the effect that he wanted to. His plan, quite clearly, was to destroy the whole property, to make sure nothing was left, to make sure no evidence was left behind, so nothing could be traced back to him.
This was all about him getting away with it. This is about him walking away and leaving whatever behind him. This wasn't about anger. This wasn't about passion. This was, how do I get out of this? And can you imagine using that amount of violence just to get out of something?
The police had sufficient evidence to go to the CPS to charge Mr. Ryan with murder.
But what really went on that fateful morning? And what may have driven David to murder Diana?
The trial of a man from the Altrincham area accused of killing a Cranage businesswoman has begun. Diana Lee, who was 54, was found dead after a fire at her home last August.
It's been 10 months since Diana Lee was found murdered in her home in Cranage. And 48-year-old David Ryan faces trial for her murder at Chester Crown Court.
Heading into the trial for this crime, I would clearly be concerned of all the evidence we've got. Have we got sufficient evidence to convict him beyond all reasonable doubt for a jury to believe the prosecution case and it's watertight? The last thing you want to do is go to a trial and there be some error or some process we haven't done. The continuity evidence has been missed somewhere and it be brought up at a Crown Court trial.
Local reporter James Wilson recalls seeing Diana's killer in the flesh.
On the first day of the trial, it was a bit of a surprise to myself to see Mr. Ryan stood there. He probably wasn't what you would describe as a person who probably capable of committing this crime, essentially. He wasn't very big, looked quite meek, and he was obviously incredibly nervous as the proceedings were about to begin.
The prosecution begins by setting out its case to the jury.
The prosecution outlined a really strong case in their opening statement. They detailed where the DNA had been found in the property, including the bedroom and other parts of the house. Quite a lot was backed up by phone records and evidence of the ANPR cameras around the area. It was an incredibly strong case and probably quite surprising that Mr. Ryan at this point was still pleading not guilty.
The prosecution reveals to the court how David first responded to police.
I think police officers were quite taken aback by Ryan's reaction to the request for a DNA swab. He wasn't happy, he became quite agitated, and he suggested he didn't want to do it. It was only after persuasion by the officers involved that mouth swab was completed.
The prosecution reveals further evidence in relation to a text Diana sent.
The police searched details on her mobile phone records. They found out that text messages had been sent in the morning to her close friends saying she'd been unwell.
A simple text message, but one which immediately flags suspicion among investigators. The text was sent early on the morning of 9th of August, when Diana was already dead.
An expert gave evidence at the trial to say that was unlikely to be the victim's text message by the language used in the text message. So sometimes we will use different experts in certain fields, and this expert would say that it wasn't the normal language used by the victim, but more likely to be used by the offender.
A linguistics expert tells the court that the style of the text message did not match Diana's typical style, but it did match David Ryan's. Despite hearing evidence linking David Ryan to the murder, the court hears he has no previous convictions. So what would lead him to commit such an atrocious crime? But as the trial unfolds, more information comes to light, hinting at a potential motive.
Obviously living in Hale, it's a very affluent suburb of Greater Manchester. Maybe from his point of view there was a pressure to keep that up. Maybe there was a pressure to keep up that pretense that he just couldn't do anymore.
This man was in financial dire straits. Now, that is one of the triggers that can cause big problems in a relationship. He may have feared that his wife was going to leave him because of these enormous debts. He may have gone out and looked for someone like Diana to be able to get some money to fix the other situation. I think he targeted Diana for money, and the reason I think that is because he spent all the money on his wife. He spent all the money on IVF treatments, on holidays, on things for his other family. He did not get invested in his relationship with Diana. So, no, I don't think he was in love with her.
He'd already taken a substantial amount of money from Diana on the premise of investing in things that just didn't exist.
But as it transpired, the deeper he got in, that was actually becoming a bigger threat to the other situation than perhaps even the finances were in the beginning.
Somewhere along the line, this man is living a lie. He's married, he's got a child, he's been in another relationship with someone secretly, and unfortunately, all these things come to an end somewhere along the line. And in these circumstances, I would have thought in relation to the victim, she's gone to his house the night before the murder. She's collected him in her car, brought her back to her house.
Diana started asking questions about the investment. You know, the money that she'd given him, where was it? How was it doing? Was she going to get any back? She wasn't a rich woman. She couldn't just chuck this money away and think, oh, well, you win some, you lose some. And I think that he was under increasing pressure from her.
She was going to possibly tell someone, tell their wife, or go to the police to say, he's targeted me.
So was David trying to protect his wife from finding out about his affair and his conning Diana out of money?
And there's a stage where there's a trigger. He was more worried about his wife finding out and her maybe leaving him. He wants to protect the relationship with his wife, but we can't simplistically say that that is because he's so in love with his wife. It is far more likely that he gets his entire identity from the relationship he has with his wife. And if you took that away from him, you'd be taking everything.
After a grueling 7-week trial at Chester Crown Court, the jury returns its verdict. David Ryan is found guilty of Diana Lee's murder.
Conman David Ryan killed his wealthy lover after cheating her out of £60,000. Today, a jury in Chester found him guilty of murder.
He is sentenced to 34 years in prison.
There were shouts from the gallery from people connected to Diana who were obviously incredibly emotional at that time, hearing what they wanted to hear. Mr. Ryan was again pretty much motionless throughout this reading. There was no real reaction from him. I think probably he expected this verdict to come out, and again, he probably wasn't surprised deep down because he knew that he'd done this incredibly bad crime.
I think the most awful thing about this case is how dispensable Diana was to him. We all know she's a really, really lovely person. There's the lodger, who he doesn't know very well, but he's quite happy for both of those people to take the fall to protect his life. He has no empathy with their suffering or what's going to happen to them.
With David now behind bars, the local community look back and think why Diana, a successful and popular business owner, might have let a criminal into her life.
Diana didn't behave strangely when she gave the money to Ryan. She behaved in a way that any of us would have behaved in similar circumstances with the same information. She didn't hand over money to a person who she thought was dodgy or that she didn't like. She was taken in by him. She may have been lonely. She cared about him. She trusted him. We give money to people we trust. She wasn't a stupid woman. In hindsight, or from where we're sitting, we can say, I would never have done that. Well, I guarantee you, if you felt the way that she did, you might well have done.
It's just worrying, really, what can happen to you. And obviously happened to Diana, which is such a shame, because she was such a lovely lady.
Still in everybody's minds, still can't believe what's happened. It's just a tragedy.
For the residents of Cranage, she will never be forgotten.
We're Kent-bound as the experts fight an unseen enemy. Follow the action right from the beginning as new Cobra Cyber War starts. Thursday at 9.
High school graduate, incompetent, and with an illness, you really have nothing going for you. After work, I ran into an old classmate from middle school. She didn't like me back then, and it seems she still doesn't. Since this was a hospital, she must be here for some illness. A few days later, we met again at the hospital. Meeting you again, this is the worst. Well, I'm actually your attending physician. What? My name is Michael. I work as an internist at a general hospital. Because I looked older, patients often mistake me for a seasoned doctor, but I started medical school late. So I've only been working here for 4 years. My colleagues, who started at the same time, were younger than me, but unlike the university hospital where I used to be a resident. I find this place very comfortable. Thanks for your hard work on the night shift. As I stretched in my chair, an office worker handed me a coffee in a paper cup. Thank you. After finishing my weekly night shift, I got ready to go home and headed to the outpatient lobby with my coffee. The lobby had an atrium, and there was a bench behind it. From there, you could see the waiting area through the glass. A large tree in the middle of the atrium provided a hidden spot. I listened to the mixed sounds people made, and it helped me relax. I heard indistinct conversations, footsteps, and various other noises. These served as background music as I slowly drank my coffee, finally releasing the tension from work. I had the day off after the night shift. I planned to take a nap and do some laundry when I got home. As I thought about this and was about to stand up, someone called out to me. "What are you doing here?" Looking up, I saw a woman about my age. She was quite attractive, but I didn't recognize her. She looked at me with a bewildered expression. Did I do something to her without realizing it? High school graduate, incompetent, and with an illness, you really have nothing going for you. As I remained silent, she threw even harsher words at me. She seemed to think I was a patient here for a checkup. Do we know each other? If she didn't know I was a doctor here, she couldn't have been a former patient. Was she a medical equipment supplier? Or a pharmaceutical sales rep? I tried hard to remember her, but I couldn't. Maybe you're mistaking me for someone else? She must have thought that I was someone else. I told her that. What? Unbelievable. She said this, turning red, and walked away. What was that about? The woman walked briskly away through the atrium. As I watched her, I saw her start receiving admission instructions at the counter, accompanied by an elderly woman. So she was a patient to be admitted. I wondered why she was so angry, but I tossed my empty coffee cup in the trash and left the hospital through the main entrance. And my day off quickly came to an end. In the end, I spent my day off doing laundry and didn't get around to watching the recordings I had saved. After a break, I always arrived at the hospital a bit early to switch gears. That day, I had a rare schedule of outpatient consultations all day. Regular patients often brought various gifts to the clinic. Today, I received some vegetables from someone's garden and dried fish sent from the countryside. Quite a haul today. A nurse said, impressed as she looked at the pile in the corner of the examination room. I live alone, so this is more than enough for me. Please feel free to take some home. I picked out a few vegetables and homemade dried fish and pickles from the bag and handed the rest to the nurse. Thank you. The outpatient nurses look forward to your days in the clinic. It helps save on grocery bills. Though the extended conversations with patients took longer, it makes it even. She said, glancing at the clock. It was already past lunch break. I did it again. Sorry. I'll be more careful. I have a bad habit of chatting too long with patients, pushing back the schedule. The nurses never complain and go along with it, but I feel bad for cutting into their valuable break time. It's fine. Thanks to your popularity, we get to save money on groceries. But you might want to treat the single nurses to lunch sometime, they'd appreciate it. Got it, I'll do that. I'm really sorry. The nurse smiled, picked some vegetables, and left, saying, see you later. Michael, did you get goodies again? My colleague, Kevin, another internist, called out as the nurse left. He always speaks to me with a touch of formality, probably because I'm older. Goodies? Yeah, I got some homemade pickled plums and dried fish today. Nice. There's plenty, so help yourself. Thanks. I live alone, so these are really appreciated. I know, right? Well, you're especially popular with the elderly. Yeah, being liked by anyone is great. You get an amazing amount of goodies. It's like a popularity contest. You're the only one who gets so many gifts every time. Really? I thought everyone got some. That's what makes you special. See you later. I stopped my colleague as he was leaving. Oh, you did the morning rounds today. Thanks. Don't mention it. It's our job. Nothing new except a new patient in a private room. When I was at the university hospital, I was always pressed for time and got scolded by nurses for talking too long with patients. There was constant competition with colleagues, all trying to please the professors. That environment didn't suit me. But here, time and relationships with colleagues were more relaxing. I'm really glad I came here. After finishing my evening consultations, I took the vegetables I'd received and stopped by my parents' house. My parents and my younger brother, Cody, who is 4 years younger, live there. Hey, Michael. Long time no see, Cody greeted me. Welcome home, Michael, my mother said. My brother and mom greeted me. I got a lot of vegetables, so I'm sharing some. Where's Dad? He's working late, my mom replied. I see. Tell him not to overwork himself. As I was about to leave after dropping off the vegetables, my mom called out to me. You haven't had dinner yet, have you? Stay and eat with us. Persuaded by my mother, I stayed for a family dinner for the first time in a while. Even though the hospital was not too far from my parents' house, I lived alone in an apartment within walking distance of the hospital. The family home is a small 3-bedroom house. It's too cramped for 4 adults to live comfortably. However, my parents liked the house, and Cody still lived with them even after becoming an adult, which spared us from having to worry about them. As the 3 of us chatted about trivial matters, my father came home. Michael, you need to come by more often. Your mother worries about you. I can do as I please because Cody's here. Having a responsible younger brother is reassuring. At this, Cody set down his chopsticks with a serious expression. Since the whole family is here, it's a good time to tell you. I'm dating someone with marriage in mind. I'd like to introduce her to you all soon. Your girlfriend? I can't wait to meet her. Our mom's eyes sparkled with joy. You used to follow me around as a kid, and now you're getting married first. Well, we're not talking about marriage just yet. She wants to focus on her career a bit longer. But she wants to meet my parents. She sounds very responsible. I'm looking forward to meeting her. How about you, Michael? Anyone special in your life? Mom peered at me with concern. Cody's happy news shifted the focus to me. I don't have anyone. Though I'm told I'm popular with the elderly, that's a completely different matter. I can't even tell my parents that I've never had a girlfriend. Well, these things are all about timing. My dad said, trying to cover for me. You had a girlfriend in middle school, though. My mom added, almost making me spit out my miso soup. She was beautiful, cute, and very capable. She already had you wrapped around her finger back then. Someone that reliable would be the only one who could handle you as a husband. They must be mistaken. Who are you talking about? Your girlfriend, Michael. She was always kind to me, helped me with my studies, and gave me lots of fancy treats. Cody chimed in, further confusing me. I had no memory of the stories they were telling. My dad listened with interest. Her name was... Mom and Cody exchanged serious looks. Dad watched them expectantly. Then they both said loudly, Sarah. Sarah. Have you seriously forgotten your ex-girlfriend? That's a bit cold, isn't it? Michael, even if you got dumped, that's too harsh. The name Sarah echoed in my mind. Sarah. At that moment, the image of the woman I met at the hospital merged with memories of Sarah from middle school. Sarah was a classmate in middle school. She was smart, and her family was wealthy, and she often belittled me for my mediocre grades and poor background. I never felt even a hint of affection from her. I couldn't imagine how anyone thought we were a couple. I wanted to ask them myself. No, it couldn't have been her. Sarah is still the same. I remembered Sarah storming off angrily at the hospital. Since she was doing the admission procedures, she must have been unwell. Yet, she seemed full of energy. Returning to the ward after 2 days, I received a handover during the morning conference. As I reviewed the charts of discharged and newly admitted patients, one name caught my eye. Sarah. It turns out the patient admitted to the